The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over downtown Charleston, its rays reflecting off the polished windshields of patrol cars lined along the busy street. The air hummed with the typical sounds of a Thursday afternoon: car engines, distant conversations, and the rhythmic clicking of heels on concrete. But this peaceful scene was about to be shattered by an encounter that would expose the ugly truth lurking beneath the surface of law enforcement. Officer Kevin Mason cruised slowly down Martin Luther King Boulevard, his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. At 38 years old, Mason had built a reputation within the Charleston Police Department as someone who got results, though his methods often raised eyebrows among the more progressive members of the force. His pale complexion was weathered by years in the sun, and his thin brown hair was slicked back beneath his police cap. There was something predatory about the way his pale blue eyes scanned the streets, always searching for an excuse to flex his authority. The radio crackled to life with routine dispatch calls, but Mason wasn't really listening. His attention was focused on the sidewalk ahead, where a distinguished-looking black man in his mid-50s was walking purposefully toward the community center. The man wore a crisp white dress shirt, black slacks, and polished dress shoes. His graying hair was neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that came from years of earning respect through hard work and dedication. This was Reverend Isaiah Davis, though Mason didn't know that yet. To the officer, he was just another black man in what Mason considered his territory, a convenient target for harassment disguised as law enforcement. Isaiah was carrying a small duffel bag and checking his phone as he walked, completely unaware that he was being watched by someone looking for trouble. Mason pulled his patrol car to the curb and stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on his belt near his radio. The sound of his car door slamming shut echoed off the nearby buildings, causing a few pedestrians to glance in his direction. He adjusted his uniform and began walking toward Isaiah with the deliberate stride of someone who believed he owned the street. "Hey, you!" Mason called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority mixed with something darker. "Stop right there!" Isaiah paused, turning to face the approaching officer with a look of mild confusion. He had been walking to choir practice at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, the same route he'd taken 3 times a week for the past 15 years. The community center doubled as a practice space for multiple church choirs in the area, and Isaiah had been the choir director at Mount Calvary for over a decade. "Is there a problem, officer?" Isaiah asked, his tone respectful but tinged with the wariness that came from being a black man in America. He kept his hands visible, a habit learned through years of navigating interactions with law enforcement. Mason stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he looked Isaiah up and down with obvious disdain. "Yeah, there's a problem. What's in the bag?" Isaiah glanced down at his duffel bag, which contained nothing more than sheet music, a pitch pipe, and a bottle of water. "Sheet music and choir supplies. I'm heading to practice at the community center." "Sheet music?" Mason scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Right, empty it out, now." A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk, their phones already coming out as the tension between the two men became palpable. Isaiah noticed the growing audience and felt his stomach tighten. He had been in enough situations like this to know that any wrong move could escalate quickly. "Officer, I'm happy to show you what's in the bag, but may I ask why this is necessary?" "I haven't done anything wrong," Isaiah said, his voice remaining calm despite the growing anxiety in his chest. Mason's face flushed red with anger. "Are you questioning me? I asked you a simple question. Empty the bag or I'll empty it for you." Isaiah took a deep breath, recognizing that resistance would only make things worse. He slowly unzipped the duffel bag and began removing its contents. Several folders of sheet music, a small pitch pipe, a bottle of water, and a notebook filled with his handwritten notes about vocal arrangements. Mason kicked at the papers scattered on the sidewalk, his boot leaving dirty marks on the carefully organized music. "What kind of drugs are you hiding in there?" "There are no drugs," Isaiah replied firmly, his patience beginning to wear thin. "As I told you, these are choir supplies. I'm a choir director." "A choir director?" Mason laughed mockingly. "Let me guess, you're also a community leader and a pillar of society, right? That's what they all say." The crowd around them had grown larger, and several people were now recording the encounter on their phones. Isaiah could hear murmurs of disapproval from the bystanders, but he knew that public opinion wouldn't protect him if Mason decided to escalate further. "Officer, I can provide identification and contact information for the church if you need verification," Isaiah offered, reaching slowly for his wallet. "Don't move!" Mason shouted, his hand moving to his taser. "Keep your hands where I can see them!" Isaiah immediately raised his hands, his heart racing as he realized how quickly the situation was spiraling out of control. "My identification is in my wallet. I was just trying to comply with your request." Mason circled around Isaiah like a predator stalking prey, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "You know what I think? I think you're dealing drugs out of that community center. I think this whole choir director story is just a cover for your real business." "That's not true," Isaiah said firmly, his voice carrying a hint of the authority he wielded in his other life, a life that Mason knew nothing about. "I've been the choir director at Mount Calvary Baptist Church for 15 years. Call Pastor Roberts if you need confirmation." Mason stopped circling and stepped closer, invading Isaiah's personal space in a clear attempt at intimidation. "I don't need to call anybody. What I need is for you to stop lying to me and tell me what you're really doing here." The bystanders grew more vocal in their disapproval, with several people shouting at Mason to leave Isaiah alone. One woman called out, "He's telling the truth. I know him from church." But Mason ignored them all, his focus entirely on the man standing before him. "Turn around and put your hands on the wall," Mason commanded, pointing to the brick wall of a nearby building. Isaiah hesitated. "Officer, I haven't committed any crime. You have no legal basis to search me." Mason's face contorted with rage. "Legal basis? I'll show you the legal basis. Turn around now or I'll make you turn around." Isaiah looked at the crowd of people watching, their faces a mixture of anger and helplessness. He could see children among them, wide-eyed and frightened by what they were witnessing. Making a decision that would later prove crucial, he slowly turned around and placed his hands against the wall. Mason roughly patted him down, his hands moving aggressively over Isaiah's body in a search that was more about humiliation than law enforcement. "Where are the drugs?" he demanded. "There are no drugs," Isaiah repeated, his voice strained but still controlled. "I told you I'm here for choir practice." Mason spun Isaiah around to face him, his face inches away. "Don't lie to me. I know your type. You act all respectable in public, but I know what you're really about." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and several people began calling for Mason to stop his harassment. One man shouted, "This is wrong. He hasn't done anything." But Mason seemed to feed off the tension, his aggressive behavior escalating with each passing moment. Isaiah stood his ground, his military training and years of public service giving him the strength to remain calm in the face of such blatant discrimination. "Officer Mason," he said, reading the name tag on the man's uniform, "I am going to file a complaint about this incident. Your behavior is unprofessional and constitutes harassment." Mason's eyes flashed with fury. "Oh, now you're threatening me, that's it." He reached for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and threatening a police officer." "What?" Isaiah exclaimed, his composure finally cracking. "I haven't threatened anyone. I said I would file a complaint, which is my legal right." But Mason was already moving, grabbing Isaiah's arm and twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. The crowd erupted in shouts of protest, with several people demanding that Mason stop his attack on the innocent man. Isaiah didn't resist, his hands remaining passive as the handcuffs clicked into place. "This is ridiculous," Isaiah said, his voice strained as Mason tightened the cuffs. "I demand to speak to your supervisor." Mason laughed coldly. My supervisor? You're in no position to demand anything. You're going downtown, and maybe a night in jail will teach you some respect. As Mason led Isaiah toward the patrol car, the crowd followed, their phones still recording every moment of the encounter. Isaiah caught the eye of Jerome Washington, a longtime member of his congregation who had witnessed the entire incident. "Call Pastor Roberts," Isaiah said quietly. "Tell him what happened." Jerome nodded, his face grim with understanding. He had watched Isaiah lead their church community for years, had seen him comfort grieving families and inspire young people to pursue their dreams. What was happening here was not justice, it was persecution. Mason shoved Isaiah into the back of the patrol car with more force than necessary, making sure the crowd could see his dominance over the situation. He slammed the door and turned to address the gathering crowd. "Show's over," he announced loudly. "This man was interfering with police business and threatening an officer. If anyone else wants to cause trouble, you can join him downtown." The crowd slowly dispersed, but not before many of them had captured clear footage of the encounter. Mason got into his car and drove away, satisfied that he had once again asserted his authority over what he saw as an unruly community. In the back seat, Isaiah sat in silence, his mind racing. He had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly and publicly. As the patrol car wound through the streets toward the police station, he reflected on the irony of his situation. Tomorrow, he was scheduled to speak at a police community relations event alongside Chief Robert Manning, praising the department's efforts to build bridges with the African American community. What Mason didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the man he had just arrested was not just a choir director. Isaiah Davis was also Senator Isaiah Davis, a respected member of the state legislature who had been instrumental in securing funding for police department reforms and community outreach programs. More importantly, he was the very senator who had endorsed Chief Manning for his current position just 2 years earlier. Mason pulled into the station parking lot, his radio crackling with routine traffic updates. He was already composing his report in his mind, crafting a narrative that would justify his actions and paint Isaiah as the aggressor. It was a story he had told before, with slight variations depending on the situation. He had perfected the art of making his victims look guilty while portraying himself as the hero. But this time, Mason had made a mistake that would cost him everything. As he led Isaiah through the station doors, past the booking desk, and into the holding area, he was walking into a trap of his own making. The truth has a way of coming to light, and Isaiah Davis was about to remind everyone in the Charleston Police Department that power without accountability is nothing more than tyranny in uniform. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Mason processed the arrest, unaware that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would expose not only his own corruption, but also the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. Isaiah sat quietly in the holding cell, his phone call already made, his lawyer already on the way, and his plan already in motion. The war was about to begin, and Mason had just picked a fight with the wrong man. The Charleston Police Department's booking area was a study in institutional neglect. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the scuffed linoleum floors, while the air hung heavy with the smell of disinfectant and desperation. Mason led Isaiah through the maze of corridors with the casual arrogance of someone who had done this countless times before. Other officers glanced up from their paperwork as they passed, some nodding at Mason in silent acknowledgement of another arrest, others returning to their tasks without a second thought. Detective Lisa Morrison, a 10-year veteran of the force with short blonde hair and tired green eyes, looked up from her desk as Mason approached with his prisoner. She had seen Mason bring in suspects before, and something about his demeanor always made her uncomfortable. There was an eagerness in his movements, a satisfaction that seemed to go beyond simple law enforcement. "What have we got, Mason?" Morrison asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly interested in the answer. Mason puffed out his chest, clearly relishing the moment. disorderly conduct, threatening a police officer, and interference with police business, found him loitering outside the community center, acting suspicious. Isaiah remained silent, his eyes taking in the details of the station around him. Years of military training and political experience had taught him to observe and remember everything. He noted the cameras in the corners, the positioning of the officers, and most importantly, the lack of professional protocol in Mason's handling of the arrest. Morrison glanced at Isaiah, taking in his clean appearance and composed demeanor. Something didn't add up. In her experience, people who threatened police officers and caused disturbances didn't usually present themselves so calmly or dress so professionally. "Did you read him his rights?" Mason waved dismissively. "Of course I did. He waived his right to remain silent. Couldn't stop talking, actually. Kept making threats and trying to tell me how to do my job." Isaiah's eyebrows raised slightly at this blatant lie, but he remained silent. He had indeed been read his rights, but he had explicitly invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney. Mason's version of events was already diverging from reality, and Isaiah was mentally cataloging each falsehood for later use. The booking process continued, with Mason filling out paperwork while Isaiah was photographed and fingerprinted. Throughout the procedure, Mason kept up a running commentary designed to humiliate and demoralize his prisoner. "You know what your problem is?" Mason said as he typed up his report. "You people think you can just do whatever you want without consequences. Well, this is what consequences look like." Isaiah met Mason's gaze steadily. "May I make my phone call now?" Mason laughed. "Oh, now you want to be polite? Where was this respect when you were threatening me on the street?" Morrison intervened, her voice carrying a note of caution. "Mason, let him make his call. We need to follow procedure." Mason's jaw tightened, but he nodded toward a phone mounted on the wall. "One call. Make it quick." Isaiah walked to the phone with measured steps, his mind already focused on his next moves. He dialed a number from memory, and after 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Sterling, Blackwood and Associates. This is Denise Franklin speaking." "Denise, it's Isaiah. I need you to come to the Charleston Police Department immediately. I've been arrested." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Denise Franklin was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state, a sharp-minded woman in her 40s who had built her career fighting exactly the kind of corruption that Isaiah was now experiencing firsthand. Her dark skin and commanding presence had intimidated many prosecutors over the years, and her win rate in civil rights cases was legendary. "Arrested?" she said, her voice sharp with concern. "On what charges?" "Disorderly conduct, threatening an officer, and interference with police business, all fabricated. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't say anything else until I arrive." Isaiah hung up the phone and returned to the booking area, where Mason was finishing his paperwork with obvious satisfaction. The officer looked up as Isaiah approached, his smirk widening. "Let me guess, you called your mommy," Mason taunted. "Or maybe some community activist who thinks they can make trouble for honest cops just doing their job." Isaiah didn't respond, instead taking a seat on the metal bench Mason indicated. His silence seemed to irritate the officer, who had clearly expected more of a reaction to his provocation. "Cat got your tongue now?" Mason pressed. "You had plenty to say on the street when you were threatening me." Detective Morrison looked up from her desk, her expression troubled. "Mason, what exactly did he say that you considered threatening?" Mason waved his hand dismissively. "He said he was going to file a complaint, get me in trouble with my supervisors. Classic intimidation tactics." Morrison's frown deepened. Filing a complaint wasn't threatening. It was a constitutional right. She had worked enough cases to know the difference between actual threats and citizens exercising their legal options. Something about Mason's story wasn't adding up, and her instincts were telling her to pay closer attention. 20 minutes later, the station doors opened, and Denise Franklin strode in with the confidence of someone who had never been intimidated by a police station. She wore a sharp black suit that commanded respect, and her natural hair was styled in a way that framed her face perfectly. Her brown eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had fought these battles before. "I'm here to see my client, Isaiah Davis," she announced to the desk sergeant, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Mason looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting to one of annoyance. "And you are?" "Denise Franklin, attorney at law," she replied, handing over her business card. "I'm representing Mr. Davis, and I need to speak with him immediately." Mason studied the card, his lips pursing as he recognized the name of one of the state's most prominent civil rights attorneys. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "Well, well," he said with mock admiration. "Your client must have some serious connections to afford a lawyer like you. Makes me wonder what he was really up to out there." Denise's eyes narrowed, her voice taking on a cold edge. "What my client was doing was exercising his constitutional right to walk down a public sidewalk. Now, may I see him?" Morrison stood up from her desk, sensing the shift in the room's dynamics. "I'll escort you to the interview room," she said, her tone professional but cautious. As Denise was led away to meet with Isaiah, Mason returned to his paperwork, but his confidence was beginning to waver. High-profile attorneys didn't usually get involved in simple disorderly conduct cases, and the fact that this choir director could afford someone of Franklin's caliber suggested there was more to this story than Mason had initially realized. In the interview room, Isaiah sat across from Denise, his hands folded on the metal table between them. The room was stark and unwelcoming, with concrete walls painted an institutional green and a single fluorescent light humming overhead. "Tell me exactly what happened," Denise said, pulling out a legal pad and pen. Isaiah recounted the encounter in precise detail, from Mason's initial approach to the moment he was handcuffed and placed in the patrol car. Denise took notes furiously, her expression growing darker with each detail. "This is textbook harassment," she said when he finished. "We have witnesses, we likely have video from bystanders, and Mason's story is already full of holes." Isaiah nodded. "There's something else you need to know, Denise, something that Mason doesn't know yet." She looked up from her notes, her pen hovering over the paper. "What is it?" Isaiah leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, but his eyes holding a fire that Denise had seen in her most determined clients. "I'm not just a choir director, I'm Senator Isaiah Davis, and 2 years ago I cast the deciding vote to confirm Robert Manning as Charleston's new police chief." Denise's pen clattered to the table, her eyes widening in shock. "You're Senator Davis? The Senator Davis who wrote the police accountability bill?" "The same," Isaiah confirmed. "And tomorrow morning I'm scheduled to speak at a community relations breakfast with Chief Manning, praising the department's progress on racial sensitivity training." Denise stared at him for a long moment, her mind racing through the implications. "Isaiah, do you realize what this means? If this gets out, it will get out," Isaiah said firmly. "The question is how we control the narrative." Mason arrested a sitting state senator based on nothing more than racial profiling. "This isn't just about seeking justice for what happened to me. It's about exposing the systemic problems that allow officers like Mason to operate with impunity." Outside the interview room, Detective Morrison was growing increasingly uncomfortable with Mason's version of events. She had pulled the preliminary report and found several inconsistencies that troubled her. Mason claimed that Isaiah had been loitering outside the community center, but the incident had occurred at 2:30 p.m. on a Thursday, a time when the center was open and hosting multiple activities. She also noticed that Mason had failed to mention the crowd of witnesses in his initial report, describing the encounter as if it had occurred in isolation. In her experience, officers who had nothing to hide didn't usually omit important details like public witnesses. Morrison made a decision that would later prove crucial to the case. She quietly pulled the patrol car's GPS records and discovered that Mason had been parked in the area for over 20 minutes before approaching Isaiah, suggesting that this had been a targeted encounter rather than a routine patrol response. Back in the interview room, Denise was outlining their legal strategy. We'll post bail tonight and get you released. Then we start building our case. But Isaiah, I need you to be prepared for what comes next. When Mason and his department realize who you are, they're going to close ranks and try to discredit you." Isaiah smiled grimly. "Let them try. I've been fighting battles like this my entire career, just usually from the other side of the table. This time, I get to fight for myself." As the evening wore on, news of the arrest began to spread through the community. Pastor Roberts arrived at the station demanding answers, followed by several members of Isaiah's congregation and political allies. The lobby of the police station filled with concerned citizens, their voices growing louder as details of the arrest leaked out. Chief Manning, who had been enjoying a quiet dinner at home with his family, received a phone call that would ruin his evening and potentially his career. When he learned that Senator Davis had been arrested by one of his officers, his blood ran cold. This was exactly the kind of incident he had been working to prevent, and now it threatened to undo years of progress in community relations. By 8 p.m., Isaiah had been released on his own recognizance, but the damage was already done. Video footage from multiple bystanders was already circulating on social media, and local news outlets were scrambling to cover the story. Mason, still unaware of his prisoner's true identity, went home that night believing he had successfully asserted his authority over another troublemaker. He had no idea that he had just declared war on one of the most powerful men in the state, and that by morning his entire world would begin to crumble around him. The truth was coming, and it would arrive like a hurricane, sweeping away the lies and exposing the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Charleston Police Department as Chief Robert Manning paced frantically in his office, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. His usually pristine uniform was wrinkled, his graying hair disheveled from running his hands through it repeatedly. The man who had built his career on community relations and progressive policing was watching his reputation crumble with each passing minute. "Yes, Senator Davis, I understand your concern," Manning said, his voice strained as he tried to maintain some semblance of professional composure. "I assure you, we will conduct a thorough investigation into Officer Mason's conduct." On the other end of the line, Isaiah sat in his study at home, still wearing the same clothes from the previous day. His voice was calm, but carried an undertone of steel that Manning had never heard before. "Chief Manning, let me be very clear about something. This wasn't just poor judgment or a misunderstanding. Your officer racially profiled me, harassed me without cause, and then arrested me on fabricated charges. This is exactly the kind of behavior we discussed during your confirmation hearings." Manning winced at the reminder. 2 years earlier, Isaiah had been his strongest supporter during the contentious process to select a new police chief. Isaiah's endorsement had been crucial in securing the position, especially given the senator's reputation as a champion of civil rights and police reform. "I understand your frustration," Manning began, but Isaiah cut him off. "Frustration?" Isaiah's voice remained calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it now. "Chief, I spent 15 hours in a holding cell because one of your officers decided that a black man walking down the street was suspicious. I missed choir practice, worried my congregation, and was humiliated in front of my community. Frustration doesn't begin to cover what I'm feeling right now." Manning sank into his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. "What do you want me to do?" "I want accountability," Isaiah replied. "I want a full investigation, not some internal review that disappears into a filing cabinet. I want Officer Mason held responsible for his actions, and I want assurance that this will never happen to anyone else in this community." After hanging up, Manning sat in his office, staring at the wall where his commendations and awards hung in neat rows. Everything he had worked for, every reform he had implemented, every bridge he had built with the community was now threatened by one officer's reckless behavior. A knock on his door interrupted his brooding. Detective Morrison entered, carrying a thick file folder and wearing an expression that suggested she wasn't bringing good news. "Chief, we need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. Manning gestured to the chair across from his desk. "If this is about the Davis arrest, I already know it's a disaster." Morrison sat down and opened her folder, revealing printed photographs, GPS records, and witness statements she had been quietly collecting since the previous evening. "It's worse than a disaster, Chief. It's a pattern." She spread the documents across Manning's desk, each piece of evidence painting a damning picture of Mason's behavior over the past several years. "I've been reviewing Mason's arrest records, and the pattern is clear. 60% of his arrests over the past 3 years have been African-American males, despite the fact that his patrol area is only 30% black." Manning's face paled as he studied the statistics. "Why wasn't this flagged before?" "Because Mason is careful," Morrison replied. "He doesn't use overtly racial language in his reports. He's learned to use code words: suspicious behavior, failure to comply, appeared agitated. But when you look at the pattern, it's unmistakable." She pulled out another set of documents. "Here are complaint records from his previous assignments. Citizens have filed 17 formal complaints against Mason in the past 5 years. 17. The department's average is 2 complaints per officer over the same period." Manning felt his stomach drop. "What happened to those complaints?" "Internal Affairs reviewed them and found no wrongdoing," Morrison said, her voice heavy with implications. "But I've been digging deeper and I found something interesting. In 12 of those cases, the complainants later withdrew their complaints or stopped cooperating with the investigation." "Why would they do that?" Morrison leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Because Mason has friends in the department who made it clear that pursuing complaints would be more trouble than it was worth. Chief, there's a culture of protection around officers like Mason, and it goes all the way up the chain of command." Manning stared at the evidence spread across his desk, each document representing a failure of the system he was supposed to oversee. "What does this have to do with the Davis arrest specifically?" Morrison pulled out her phone and showed Manning a video that had been posted to social media overnight. "This is footage from yesterday's arrest. Watch Mason's behavior and tell me this looks like professional police work." The video was grainy and shaky, but the audio was clear. Manning watched in horror as Mason berated Isaiah, kicked his belongings, and made thinly veiled racial comments. When Mason's voice came through the phone speakers saying, "You people think you can just do whatever you want," Manning closed his eyes in defeat. "How many views?" he asked quietly. 50,000 and climbing, Morrison replied. "And that's just one video. There are at least 6 different angles floating around on various platforms." Manning's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. He glanced at it and his face went white. "The mayor wants to see me in her office in 1 hour. "Chief, there's something else," Morrison said, her voice hesitant. "Something about Senator Davis that you need to know." Manning looked up sharply. "What about him?" "I did some background checking after the arrest. Isaiah Davis isn't just any state senator. He's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee's subcommittee on police reform. He wrote the police accountability bill that passed last year, and he's been one of the most vocal advocates for law enforcement transparency in the state." The color drained completely from Manning's face. "You're telling me that Mason arrested the man who literally wrote the book on police accountability?" "It gets worse," Morrison continued. "Senator Davis is scheduled to speak at our community relations breakfast tomorrow morning. He was going to praise the department's progress on racial sensitivity training and announce a new funding initiative for community policing programs." Manning stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall. "Cancel it. Cancel everything." "I can't," Morrison said. "The media is already planning to cover the event. If we cancel now, especially after last night's arrest, it will look like we're trying to hide something." Manning began pacing again, his mind racing through possible damage control scenarios. "What's Mason's story? Has he said anything about knowing who Davis is?" "He has no idea," Morrison replied. "I've been watching him all morning and he's been bragging to other officers about arresting another troublemaker. He thinks he's a hero. At that moment, Mason himself appeared in the doorway, his face bright with satisfaction. "Chief, I wanted to update you on that arrest from yesterday. Clean case, solid evidence. The guy hired some fancy lawyer, but my report is airtight." Manning stared at Mason with a mixture of disbelief and horror. "Officer Mason, do you have any idea who you arrested yesterday?" Mason shrugged confidently. "Some choir director who thought he could intimidate me? Why? Is there a problem?" Morrison and Manning exchanged glances, both recognizing that Mason's ignorance was about to make an already catastrophic situation even worse. "The problem," Manning said slowly, his voice barely controlled, "is that you arrested Senator Isaiah Davis. The same Senator Davis who endorsed me for this position. The same Senator Davis who chairs the Police Accountability Subcommittee." Mason's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, dawning horror. "That's impossible. The guy I arrested was just some what, Mason?" Manning's voice was like ice. "Some black man who you decided didn't belong in your neighborhood?" Mason's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Chief, I had no idea. He never identified himself as a senator." "Did you ask for his identification?" Morrison interjected. Mason hesitated. "Well, he was being uncooperative." "That's not what I asked," Morrison pressed. "Did you ask to see his ID before you arrested him?" Mason's silence was answer enough. Manning sat down heavily in his chair, his head in his hands. "Mason, do you understand what you've done? You've just handed every police reform advocate in the state a gift-wrapped example of everything that's wrong with law enforcement." The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in for Mason. His face had gone pale and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Chief, maybe we can work something out. I mean, it was an honest mistake." "An honest mistake?" Manning looked up sharply. "Mason, I've seen the video. I've read the witness statements that Detective Morrison has been collecting. This wasn't a mistake. This was racial profiling, pure and simple." Mason's desperation was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. "Sir, I've been a loyal officer for 10 years. I've never had any serious complaints." Morrison held up the folder she had shown Manning earlier. 17 complaints, Mason. 17. Mason stared at the folder as if it contained his death warrant. "Those were all dismissed." "Because the system protected you," Manning said, his voice heavy with disgust. "Because officers like you have been allowed to operate without consequences for too long." Well, that ends now. The intercom on Manning's desk crackled to life. "Chief, the mayor is on line 1. She says it's urgent." Manning picked up the phone, his face grave. "Yes, Mayor Henderson, I understand. Yes, we're aware of the situation. No, I don't think a statement will be sufficient. Yes, I'll be right there." He hung up and looked at Mason with an expression of finality. "Mason, you're suspended pending a full investigation. Turn in your badge and weapon." Mason's face went white. "Chief, please. My career, my family. I made a mistake, but I can fix this." "The only mistake here was mine," Manning replied coldly. "I should have dealt with you years ago. Now it's too late." As Mason reluctantly handed over his badge and service weapon, the weight of his actions began to settle on him like a lead blanket. He had always believed that his position as a police officer made him untouchable, that the thin blue line would protect him from consequences. But as he walked out of the station that morning, officially suspended and facing an uncertain future, he began to realize that he had crossed a line that even his fellow officers couldn't ignore. The media storm that followed was swift and merciless. By noon, every major news outlet in the state was running the story. State senator arrested by Charleston police officer in apparent case of racial profiling. The video footage from the arrest had been broadcast repeatedly, each replay making Mason's behavior look worse and more indefensible. Isaiah stood in his campaign office surrounded by staff members and advisors who were scrambling to manage the crisis. His communications director, a young woman named Rebecca Torres, was fielding calls from reporters while simultaneously monitoring social media for the public's reaction. "Senator, CNN wants a statement," Rebecca said, looking up from her laptop. "And the governor's office has called 3 times. Isaiah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Schedule a press conference for this afternoon. I want to address this head-on." Denise, who had been working through the legal implications of the arrest, looked up from her own stack of papers. "Isaiah, are you sure that's wise? Sometimes it's better to let the legal process play out quietly." Isaiah shook his head. "This isn't just about me, Denise. Every person in that crowd yesterday saw what happened. Every parent who watched that video is wondering if their child could be next. I have a responsibility to speak out." Meanwhile, at Mason's modest home in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Charleston, the officer sat in his living room staring at the television screen in disbelief. His wife, Carol, a nurse at the local hospital, stood behind his chair with her arms crossed, her face a mask of disappointment and anger. "Kevin, how could you not know?" she demanded, her voice sharp with frustration. "How could you arrest a state senator and not realize who he was?" Mason's hand shook as he reached for the remote, turning up the volume as a news anchor discussed the incident. "He looked like every other troublemaker I've dealt with. How was I supposed to know he was some big-shot politician?" Carol walked around to face him, her eyes blazing. "Maybe if you had treated him like a human being instead of a suspect, it wouldn't have mattered who he was." Mason's temper flared. "Don't lecture me about police work, Carol. You have no idea what it's like out there." "What it's like out there?" Carol's voice rose to match his. "Kevin, I've watched the video. Everyone has watched the video. You humiliated that man for no reason other than the color of his skin." Mason stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I was doing my job." "No," Carol said firmly, "you were being a racist bully. And now the whole world can see it." Back at the police station, the atmosphere was tense and uncomfortable. Officers who had previously shared Mason's attitudes were now questioning their own behavior, worried that they might be next in line for scrutiny. The department's Internal Affairs Division had been flooded with requests for case reviews, and several officers were already consulting with their union representatives. Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, a veteran officer who had worked with Mason for several years, sat in the break room with Detective Morrison, both of them nursing cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. "I always knew Mason had issues," Rodriguez said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "But I never thought he'd be stupid enough to arrest a sitting senator." Morrison nodded grimly. "The problem is that Mason thought he was protected. He thought that as long as he followed the unwritten rules, don't leave obvious evidence, don't target anyone with connections, keep your racism subtle, he could do whatever he wanted." "And he was right, wasn't he?" Rodriguez replied bitterly. "How many complaints did we all ignore? How many times did we look the other way when Mason crossed the line?" Morrison stared into her coffee, the weight of her complicity heavy on her shoulders. "Too many times, Tommy. Way too many times." The conversation was interrupted by Officer James Butler, a young black officer who had joined the force just 2 years earlier. His face was tight with anger as he approached their table. "Did you see the news?" Butler asked, his voice barely controlled. "They're calling it an isolated incident." Isolated, like this is the first time something like this has happened. Rodriguez and Morrison exchanged uncomfortable glances. They both knew that Mason's behavior was far from isolated, but acknowledging that truth meant admitting their own failures to act when they had the chance. "James," Morrison said carefully, "Internal Affairs is opening a full investigation. This won't be swept under the rug." Butler laughed bitterly. "Internal Affairs? The same Internal Affairs that cleared Mason 17 times before? Forgive me if I'm not holding my breath." The young officer's words hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering times when he had witnessed Mason's questionable behavior and chosen to remain silent. "What do you want us to do, James?" Rodriguez asked. We can't change what happened." Butler leaned on the table, his eyes intense. "We can tell the truth. We can stop pretending that Mason is some rogue officer who came out of nowhere. We can admit that the department has a problem, and we can do something about it." Meanwhile, in the mayor's office across town, Mayor Linda Henderson was conducting her own crisis management session. A tall, silver-haired woman in her 60s, Henderson had built her political career on promises of transparency and good government. Now she was facing a scandal that threatened to undermine everything she had worked to achieve. "How bad is this?" she asked her chief of staff, a sharp-eyed man named David Kellerman who had been fielding calls from reporters all morning. "Bad," Kellerman replied bluntly. "The story has been picked up by national media. We're getting calls from CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Everyone wants a statement." Henderson rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. "What's the legal exposure?" "Significant," her legal counsel, Elizabeth Harper, interjected. Harper was a seasoned attorney who specialized in municipal liability issues. Senator Davis could sue the city for civil rights violations, false arrest, and emotional distress. Given his profile and the circumstances, we're looking at a potential settlement in the millions. "And that's assuming this doesn't go to trial," Kellerman added. "If Senator Davis decides to make this a public fight, it could drag on for months and keep the story in the headlines." Henderson stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the city she had sworn to serve. "What do we know about this Officer Mason?" Harper consulted her notes. "Kevin Mason, 38 years old, 10 years with the Charleston PD. Multiple complaints in his file, but no sustained findings of misconduct. His union representative is already putting together a defense strategy." "Of course they are," Henderson muttered. The police union's aggressive protection of problem officers had been a source of frustration throughout her tenure as mayor. "What about Chief Manning?" "Manning's in full damage control mode," Kellerman replied. "He's suspended Mason pending investigation and is trying to distance the department from the incident." Henderson turned back to face her staff. "Here's what we're going to do. I want a complete review of Officer Mason's cases, going back to his first day on the force. I want to know how many other people have been wrongly arrested or harassed. And I want answers about why 17 complaints didn't result in any disciplinary action." Harper nodded, taking notes. "That's going to be a massive undertaking. It could take months. Then we'd better get started," Henderson replied firmly. "Because if we don't get ahead of this story, it's going to destroy all of us." As the morning progressed, the story continued to gain momentum. Isaiah's phone rang constantly with calls from supporters, fellow legislators, and civil rights organizations offering their assistance. The NAACP announced that they would be monitoring the investigation closely, and the ACLU issued a statement calling for a federal review of the Charleston Police Department's practices. But perhaps most significantly, other victims of Mason's behavior began to come forward. Jerome Washington, who had witnessed Isaiah's arrest, started reaching out to members of his community who had their own stories of encounters with Mason. What emerged was a pattern of harassment and intimidation that had been going on for years, targeting primarily young black men who didn't have the resources or connections to fight back. By the time Isaiah's press conference began that afternoon, the story had evolved from a single incident into a broader examination of police misconduct and systemic racism. Isaiah stood at the podium in his campaign office, flanked by Denise and several community leaders, his expression serious but determined. "Yesterday afternoon I was walking to choir practice when I was stopped, harassed, and ultimately arrested by Officer Kevin Mason of the Charleston Police Department," Isaiah began, his voice clear and steady. "I was not breaking any laws. I was not causing any disturbance. I was simply a black man walking down a public sidewalk, and apparently that was enough to make me a suspect in Officer Mason's eyes." The cameras flashed as reporters took notes, hanging on every word. Isaiah continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "This incident is not about me. It's about every person of color who has been targeted by law enforcement simply because of how they look. It's about a system that has allowed officers like Mason to operate with impunity, protected by a culture of silence and complicity. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the line that would become the cornerstone of his fight for justice. Officer Mason made one crucial mistake yesterday. He assumed that I was powerless to fight back. He was wrong. The Mount Calvary Baptist Church had never seen anything like it. By Thursday evening, less than 24 hours after Isaiah's arrest, the sanctuary was packed beyond capacity with congregation members, community activists, and concerned citizens who had come to show their support. The wooden pews, which normally held about 300 people during Sunday service, were overflowing with nearly 500 individuals who had heard about their choir director's ordeal and wanted to take action. Pastor William Roberts, a gentleman in his 70s with kind eyes and silver hair, stood at the pulpit looking out at the sea of faces before him. He had known Isaiah for over 15 years, had watched him transform their small church choir into one of the most respected musical groups in the city. More importantly, he had seen Isaiah use his political position to fight for the very reforms that were now desperately needed. "Brothers and sisters," Pastor Roberts began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent comforting the afflicted and challenging the comfortable, "we gather tonight not in anger but in solidarity. What happened to Brother Isaiah yesterday could have happened to any of us." In the front row sat Jerome Washington, his wife Keisha beside him, both of them still shaken by what they had witnessed. Jerome had known Isaiah since childhood. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same schools, and had watched each other build successful lives despite the obstacles placed in their paths. "I saw the whole thing," Jerome had told the packed sanctuary earlier. "Brother Isaiah was walking to practice, same as he does every Thursday. That officer didn't approach him because he was doing anything wrong. He approached him because he was black and walking with purpose, and that was enough to make him suspicious." 3 rows back, Keisha Roberts wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to the testimonies. A social worker in her 40s, Keisha had spent her career helping families navigate systems that seemed designed to work against them. She had seen too many young black men disappear into the justice system for minor infractions or, in some cases, for no infractions at all. "My son is 16, she said when Pastor Roberts invited community members to share their thoughts. "Every time he leaves the house, I worry that he'll encounter an officer like Mason. No mother should have to live with that fear." The crowd murmured in agreement, many nodding their heads as they recognized their own fears reflected in Keisha's words. Isaiah sat near the back of the sanctuary, having arrived quietly about an hour into the gathering. He had wanted to observe before participating, to understand how his arrest was affecting the community he had served for so long. When Pastor Roberts spotted him, the entire congregation turned to look at their choir director and senator. The applause that followed was thunderous, lasting several minutes despite Isaiah's attempts to wave it away. When the noise finally subsided, Pastor Roberts invited him to speak. Isaiah walked slowly to the front of the church, his steps measured and deliberate. He had spoken in this sanctuary countless times before, leading the congregation in song and offering occasional remarks during service. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just their choir director or their senator, he was their brother who had been wronged, and they were demanding justice. "Thank you all for being here," Isaiah began, his voice soft but carrying clearly throughout the packed sanctuary. "When Officer Mason arrested me yesterday, I don't think he realized that he wasn't just attacking me, he was attacking all of us." The congregation listened intently as Isaiah recounted the details of his arrest, his voice never rising above conversational level but carrying the weight of righteous anger. He spoke about the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of his community, about the fear he had seen in the eyes of the children who witnessed his treatment, and about the system that had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. "But I want you to know something," Isaiah continued, his voice growing stronger. I am not a victim. We are not victims. We are citizens demanding the respect and dignity that we deserve, and we will not be silenced. The crowd erupted in applause again, but Isaiah held up his hand for quiet. However, our response to this injustice must be measured and strategic. We cannot fight hatred with hatred. We must fight it with truth, with courage, and with the determination to create lasting change. As Isaiah spoke, Chief Manning sat in his office watching a live stream of the gathering on his computer. His face grew more troubled with each passing minute as he realized the full scope of the community's anger. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about years of accumulated grievances and broken promises. His phone rang and he glanced at the caller ID before answering reluctantly. Chief Manning speaking. Chief, this is Councilman Robert Hayes. Hayes was a longtime city council member and a political ally of both Manning and Mayor Henderson. I'm watching the church gathering online. This is getting out of hand. Manning leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident in his voice. Robert, I know how it looks, but we're handling it appropriately. Mason has been suspended, and we're conducting a full investigation. That's not enough, Hayes replied sharply. Do you understand the political implications here? Senator Davis has allies throughout the state legislature. If he decides to make this a crusade, he could undo every reform initiative we've worked on for the past 5 years. What do you want me to do? Manning asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Fire Mason immediately. Make it clear that this behavior has no place in the Charleston Police Department. Manning was quiet for a moment, weighing his options. Mason was protected by union contracts and civil service rules that made immediate termination difficult without a formal hearing process. But Hayes was right about the political implications. This situation could spiral out of control quickly if not handled decisively. I'll speak with the union representative, Manning said finally. But you know as well as I do that we have to follow proper procedures. Back at the church, the gathering was winding down, but the energy in the room remained electric. Isaiah had announced that he would be working with civil rights organizations to push for comprehensive police reform, not just in Charleston, but throughout the state. The congregation had committed to attending city council meetings, organizing voter registration drives, and making their voices heard in every forum available to them. As people began to file out of the sanctuary, Isaiah was approached by several community members who wanted to share their own stories of encounters with Mason and other officers. What emerged was a troubling pattern of behavior that went far beyond the previous day's incident. Maria Gonzalez, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s who worked as a teacher's aide at the local elementary school, described being pulled over by Mason 3 times in the past year for alleged traffic violations. Each time she had been questioned extensively about where she was going and what she was doing, despite having committed no infractions. He made me feel like a criminal, Maria said, her voice shaking slightly. Like I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. David Thompson, a college student home for summer break, told of being stopped by Mason while walking home from his job at a local grocery store. Despite being in uniform and carrying his work badge, Mason had detained him for over an hour, claiming he matched the description of a suspect in a nearby burglary. The suspect was supposed to be 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, David said. I'm 5'7" and weigh 140, but apparently being young and black was close enough for Officer Mason. Isaiah listened to each story with growing anger, not at the individuals sharing their experiences, but at the system that had failed them so completely. Each account reinforced his determination to ensure that Mason faced consequences for his actions and that meaningful reforms were implemented to prevent future abuses. As the church finally emptied, Isaiah remained behind with Pastor Roberts and Jerome Washington. The 3 men sat in the front pew, the weight of the day's events settling over them like a heavy blanket. Brother Isaiah, Pastor Roberts said quietly, I've been praying about this situation, and I believe God has placed you in this position for a reason. You have the platform and the power to create real change. Isaiah nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing, Pastor. This arrest may have been the worst thing that's happened to me personally, but it might be the best thing that could happen for our community." Jerome looked between the two older men, his expression troubled. "But what if they try to retaliate? What if Mason's friends in the department come after you?" Isaiah smiled grimly. "Let them try. I didn't serve in the Marine Corps and spend 20 years in politics to be intimidated by a racist cop and his enablers." The revelation that Isaiah was a Marine veteran was news to many in the community, though it explained the calm strength he had displayed during his arrest. He had served 2 tours in Iraq before returning home to pursue a law degree and eventually a career in public service. His military background, combined with his political experience, made him a formidable opponent for anyone foolish enough to underestimate him. Outside the church, local news crews were setting up for live broadcasts, their bright lights illuminating the parking lot as reporters prepared to update their audiences on the day's developments. The story was no longer just local news. It had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. Isaiah stepped outside into the warm evening air, immediately surrounded by microphones and cameras. He had spent enough time in politics to know how to handle media attention, but this was different. This time, it was personal. "Senator Davis," called out Rachel Goldman, a reporter from the state's largest newspaper, "what do you hope to accomplish by speaking out about this incident?" Isaiah looked directly into the cameras, his voice clear and unwavering. "I hope to accomplish what every citizen should expect from their government: accountability, transparency, and justice. Officer Mason's behavior yesterday was not an aberration. It was the inevitable result of a system that has failed to hold officers accountable for their actions." Another reporter, a young man from a local television station, pushed forward with his microphone. "Senator, some people are saying that you're using your political position to get special treatment. How do you respond to that?" Isaiah's expression hardened slightly. "Special treatment would have been Officer Mason recognizing who I was and deciding not to arrest me. What I'm asking for is equal treatment, the same treatment that every citizen deserves regardless of their race, their profession, or their political connections." As the impromptu press conference continued, Mason sat in his darkened living room, watching the coverage with a growing sense of dread. His wife had gone to bed hours earlier, disgusted by the entire situation and the attention it was bringing to their family. His children, ages 12 and 14, had already faced questions from their classmates about their father's behavior. Mason's phone buzzed with a text message from his union representative. "Emergency meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Don't talk to media or internal affairs without me present." But even as his union prepared to defend him, Mason was beginning to realize that this fight was different from the others he had faced. Previous complaints had been handled quietly, resolved through backroom negotiations and settlements that kept the details out of public view. This time, the spotlight was too bright, the victim too prominent, and the evidence too clear for the usual damage control tactics to work. As the news coverage continued late into the night, the story began to resonate beyond Charleston's borders. Civil rights organizations across the country issued statements condemning Mason's actions and calling for comprehensive police reform. Social media platforms buzzed with commentary and analysis, with hashtags like "Justice for Isaiah" and "Doc Accountability Now" trending nationally. In his study at home, Isaiah sat at his desk reviewing legal documents and planning his next moves. Denise had left him with a stack of papers outlining their options for both criminal and civil proceedings against Mason and the department. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage, witness statements, and Mason's own contradictory reports painted a clear picture of racial profiling and abuse of power. But Isaiah knew that winning in court would only be the beginning. Real change would require sustained pressure on the political system, comprehensive reforms to police training and accountability measures, and a fundamental shift in how law enforcement viewed its relationship with the communities it served. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a familiar number: Governor Patricia Williams, a longtime ally and fellow advocate for criminal justice reform. Isaiah, I just heard about what happened, the governor said, her voice heavy with concern. Are you all right? I'm fine, Pat, Isaiah replied. But this is bigger than what happened to me. This is about a pattern of behavior that has been allowed to continue for too long. What do you need from me? The governor asked without hesitation. Isaiah smiled, grateful for the support, but knowing that this fight had to be won at the local level to have lasting impact. Your continued support for police reform legislation, and maybe a statement expressing concern about what happened. You'll have both, the governor assured him. And Isaiah, give them hell. As Isaiah hung up the phone, he looked at the framed photographs on his desk, pictures of his Marine unit from Iraq, his swearing-in ceremony as a senator, and his choir performing at the church's anniversary celebration. Each image represented a different aspect of his life, but they all shared a common theme: service to others and a commitment to standing up for what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal process began in earnest. Mason would have his day in court, protected by lawyers and union representatives who would do everything possible to minimize the consequences of his actions. But Isaiah was ready for that fight. He had faced worse enemies in places far more dangerous than a Charleston courtroom. The truth was on his side, and the truth had a way of prevailing, even when the odds seemed stacked against it. Mason had picked the wrong man to mess with, and now he was about to learn just how costly that mistake would be. The Charleston Police Department's Internal Affairs Division occupied a windowless suite of offices on the third floor of the downtown precinct, a location that seemed deliberately designed to discourage visitors. Detective Captain Sarah Mitchell, a 20-year veteran with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, had been conducting internal investigations long enough to recognize when a case was going to be more complicated than it initially appeared. Mitchell sat at her desk at 6 in the morning, hours before her usual start time, reviewing the preliminary reports from Isaiah's arrest. The coffee in her mug had grown cold as she pored over Mason's account of events, cross-referencing it with the witness statements that Detective Morrison had collected and the video evidence that was now circulating widely on social media. Mason's report was a masterpiece of creative writing, she had to admit. He had carefully crafted a narrative that portrayed Isaiah as aggressive and threatening while painting himself as a professional officer responding appropriately to a volatile situation. But the video evidence told a completely different story, and the contradictions were glaring enough to make Mitchell's job both easier and more disturbing. Her computer chimed with an incoming email from Chief Manning. "Sarah, I need a preliminary report on the Mason Davis incident by end of business today. This is our top priority until further notice. RM." Mitchell sighed and reached for her phone. The first step in any internal investigation was to interview all parties involved, starting with the accused officer. Mason's union representative had already requested that any questioning be delayed until they could prepare. But Mitchell knew that time was not on their side. Every hour that passed without action would be seen as evidence that the department was trying to protect one of its own. She dialed Mason's number, not really expecting him to answer. To her surprise, he picked up on the second ring, his voice heavy with exhaustion and anxiety. "Mason speaking. Kevin, this is Captain Mitchell from Internal Affairs. I need you to come in for an interview this morning." There was a long pause before Mason responded. "My union rep said not to talk to anyone without him present." "That's your right," Mitchell replied, "but I should warn you that your cooperation, or lack thereof, will be noted in my report. When can you and your representative be here?" Mason's breathing was audible over the phone. "Give me 2 hours." After hanging up, Mitchell turned her attention to the witness statements that Morrison had collected. She was impressed by the detective's thoroughness. Morrison had not only interviewed the bystanders who had recorded the incident, but had also canvassed the area for additional witnesses and security camera footage. The statements painted a consistent picture of Mason's behavior that contradicted nearly every aspect of his official report. According to multiple witnesses, Isaiah had been walking normally when Mason approached him, had complied with all requests to show the contents of his bag, and had never made any threatening gestures or statements. More troubling were the details about Mason's language and demeanor during the encounter. Several witnesses reported hearing Mason make statements like, "You people," and "I know your type," comments that clearly indicated racial bias. One witness, an elderly white woman named Eleanor Thompson, who lived in a nearby apartment building, had provided a particularly damning account. "That officer was looking for trouble from the moment he got out of his car," Thompson had told Morrison. "He didn't approach that gentleman like he was investigating a crime. He approached him like he was hunting prey." Mitchell made a note to interview Thompson personally. Elderly white witnesses often carried particular weight in cases involving racial profiling, as their testimony couldn't be dismissed as easily as that of community members who might be seen as biased in favor of the accused. At 8 o'clock sharp, Mason arrived at the Internal Affairs office, accompanied by his union representative, a heavy-set man named Frank Kowalski, who had been defending problem officers for over 15 years. Kowalski wore an expensive suit that contrasted sharply with Mason's rumpled civilian clothes and haggard appearance. The officer looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking slightly as he took a seat across from Mitchell's desk. "Captain Mitchell," Kowalski began before anyone else could speak, "my client is here voluntarily to cooperate with your investigation. However, I want it on record that Officer Mason acted within departmental guidelines and was simply doing his job." Mitchell looked at Mason, noting how he avoided eye contact and seemed to shrink into his chair. "Officer Mason, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened yesterday afternoon, starting from when you first observed Mr. Davis." Mason cleared his throat nervously. "I was on routine patrol when I observed a suspicious individual near the community center. The subject was carrying a bag and acting in a manner that suggested possible criminal activity." "What specifically about Mr. Davis's behavior struck you as suspicious?" Mitchell asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Mason hesitated, glancing at his union representative before answering. "He was loitering, and when I approached him, he became immediately hostile and uncooperative." Mitchell consulted her notes. "According to witnesses, Mr. Davis was walking purposefully toward the community center entrance when you stopped him. How do you define loitering in this context?" "He was standing around looking suspicious," Mason replied, his voice becoming defensive. "I've been doing this job for 10 years, Captain. I know suspicious behavior when I see it." Kowalski intervened. "Captain, Officer Mason's training and experience give him the expertise to identify potential criminal activity. He acted on his professional judgment." Mitchell turned to a fresh page in her notepad. "Officer Mason, you reported that Mr. Davis threatened you. Can you tell me exactly what he said?" Mason's eyes darted nervously around the room. "He said he was going to get me in trouble with my supervisors. He was trying to intimidate me." "And you interpreted a citizen's statement that he would file a complaint as a threat?" "It was the way he said it," Mason insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "He was aggressive, confrontational." Mitchell had watched the video footage multiple times, and Mason's description bore no resemblance to what the cameras had captured. Isaiah's voice had been calm throughout the encounter, even when Mason was clearly trying to provoke him. "Officer Mason, are you aware that threatening a police officer is a specific charge with particular legal requirements? Can you explain how Mr. Davis's statement met those requirements?" Mason's face flushed red. "Look, I was there. I know what happened. These videos don't show everything." "Actually," Mitchell said, consulting another document, "we have footage from 6 different angles, including security cameras from 3 nearby businesses. The coverage is quite comprehensive." Kowalski shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Captain, unless you're charging my client with a crime, I think we've answered enough questions for today." Mitchell closed her notepad and looked directly at Mason. "Officer Mason, I'm going to be honest with you. The evidence in this case is overwhelming and it doesn't support your version of events. You have an opportunity right now to tell the truth about what happened and perhaps salvage some portion of your career." Mason's jaw tightened. "I've told you the truth." "Have you?" Mitchell asked. "Because according to your report, you approached Mr. Davis because he was loitering, but the GPS records from your patrol car show that you were parked in that area for 23 minutes before making contact. That suggests you were specifically watching him, not responding to observed criminal activity." Mason's face went white. I was conducting surveillance of the area. There had been reports of drug activity." Mitchell consulted her computer. "I've checked dispatch records for the past month. There were no reports of drug activity in that area, and you weren't assigned to any surveillance operations." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Mason looked at his union representative desperately, but Kowalski's expression suggested that even he was beginning to realize how difficult this case would be to defend. "Officer Mason," Mitchell continued, "let me ask you directly, did you approach Mr. Davis because of his race?" "That's outrageous!" Mason exploded, jumping to his feet. "I don't see color when I'm doing my job." "Then help me understand," Mitchell said calmly, "why a well-dressed, middle-aged man walking to choir practice struck you as suspicious enough to justify a 20-minute surveillance followed by a confrontational stop." Mason sat back down heavily, his hands shaking more noticeably now. I had a feeling. Cop instincts." Mitchell made a final note in her pad. "Officer Mason, I'm recommending that you be placed on unpaid administrative leave pending the completion of this investigation. You'll be hearing from the district attorney's office regarding potential criminal charges." Mason's face crumpled. "Criminal charges for doing my job? For false arrest, violation of civil rights, and filing a false police report," Mitchell replied matter-of-factly. "The evidence suggests that you arrested Mr. Davis without probable cause and then lied in your official report to justify your actions." Kowalski stood up quickly. "Captain, that's premature. We haven't even completed our investigation. Mr. Kowalski, your client has had ample opportunity to provide an accurate account of events. His story has changed 3 times in this interview alone, and it contradicts physical evidence that would be difficult to dispute in court." As Mason and his representative left the Internal Affairs office, word was already spreading throughout the department that the investigation was moving quickly and that charges were likely. Officers who had previously viewed Mason as a fellow warrior in the fight against crime were now distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone who had become a liability. Meanwhile, across town at the district attorney's office, prosecutor David Sterling was having the worst morning of his career. Sterling, an ambitious man in his early 40s with sandy brown hair and political aspirations of his own, had built his reputation on being tough on crime and supportive of law enforcement. Now he was facing a case that could force him to prosecute a police officer, potentially alienating the very constituency that had helped elect him. His assistant, a sharp young lawyer named Jennifer Kim, knocked on his office door before entering with a stack of legal briefs. "David, the Davis case just got more complicated." Sterling looked up from his computer where he had been reading news coverage of the arrest. "How could it possibly get more complicated?" Kim placed the briefs on his desk. "Senator Davis's attorney has filed a formal complaint with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. They're opening a federal investigation into the Charleston Police Department's practices." Sterling's face went pale. A federal investigation would mean months or years of scrutiny, with FBI agents reviewing every arrest, every complaint, and every use of force incident in the department's recent history. It would also mean that his office's handling of the Mason case would be under federal oversight. "What are they looking for specifically?" Sterling asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Pattern and practice violations," Kim replied. "They want to determine if there's a systemic problem with racial bias in the department's enforcement activities." Sterling leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What's your assessment of the case against Mason?" Kim pulled out her legal pad, her expression grim. "It's strong, very strong. We have video evidence, multiple witnesses, and Mason's own report contains several statements that can be proven false. If this goes to trial, conviction is almost certain. And if we don't prosecute, then we look like we're protecting a racist cop. The federal investigation intensifies, and Senator Davis probably runs for Attorney General on a platform of prosecuting corrupt officials. Sterling understood the implications immediately. Isaiah Davis was popular enough and well-connected enough to make a credible run for higher office, and this incident had given him a powerful platform to advocate for criminal justice reform. Failing to prosecute Mason would hand Isaiah a campaign issue that could resonate with voters across racial lines. "What's the timeline for filing charges?" Sterling asked. "We have 72 hours from the arrest to file, but realistically we should move within 24 hours, Kim replied. "The longer we wait, the more it looks like we're dragging our feet." Sterling nodded grimly. "Draft the charges: false arrest, violation of civil rights under color of law, and filing a false police report. Let's move quickly and decisively." As Sterling's office prepared to file charges against Mason, the officer himself was discovering just how quickly his world could unravel. His union representative had arranged a meeting at a downtown law office, but the tone was far from optimistic. "Kevin, I'm going to be straight with you," Kowalski said as they sat in a sterile conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "This case is bad, really bad. The video evidence alone is enough to convict you, and that's before we factor in who your victim turned out to be." Mason slumped in his chair, his face pale and drawn. "Frank, I've been a good cop for 10 years. I've made arrests, solved cases, kept the community safe. Doesn't that count for anything?" Kowalski shuffled through his papers, avoiding Mason's gaze. "Your service record does show dedication to the job, but Kevin, we have to deal with reality here. You arrested a sitting state senator on false charges. This isn't going to be handled like your previous complaints." "Previous complaints?" Mason's voice rose defensively. "Those were all dismissed. I was cleared of any wrongdoing." "You were cleared because the complainants didn't have the resources or connections to fight the system," Kowalski replied bluntly. "Senator Davis has both, plus a civil rights attorney who's never lost a case like this." Mason stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. "So what are you saying? That I'm finished?" "I'm saying that we need to consider all our options, including a plea agreement that might minimize the damage to your future." Mason spun around, his face flushed with anger. "A plea agreement? I'm not pleading guilty to anything. I was doing my job." Kowalski sighed heavily. "Kevin, your job doesn't include arresting people for walking while black. And that's exactly what the prosecution is going to argue." Meanwhile, at the district attorney's office, Sterling was preparing for what would be one of the most high-profile press conferences of his career. He stood in front of a mirror in his private bathroom, adjusting his tie and rehearsing the statement he would make to the media. The decision to prosecute Mason had been difficult politically, but legally, it was a no-brainer. Kim knocked on his door. "David, it's time. The media is set up in the main conference room." Sterling took a deep breath and walked into the conference room where a dozen reporters and camera crews were waiting. The room was cramped and stuffy, with bright television lights making the temperature uncomfortably warm. He approached the podium with the confidence of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. "Good afternoon," Sterling began, his voice clear and authoritative. "After a thorough review of the evidence surrounding yesterday's arrest of Senator Isaiah Davis, my office has filed criminal charges against Officer Kevin Mason." The room erupted with questions, but Sterling held up his hand for silence. "Officer Mason has been charged with false arrest, violation of civil rights under color of law, and filing a false police report. These are serious charges that reflect the severity of his misconduct." Rachel Goldman, the newspaper reporter who had covered Isaiah's press conference the night before, raised her hand. "Mr. Sterling, what message do you hope this prosecution sends?" Sterling looked directly into the cameras. "The message is simple. No one is above the law. Not civilians, not police officers, not elected officials. When someone abuses their authority to violate the rights of others, they will be held accountable. Another reporter called out, "What about Officer Mason's claim that he was following standard procedures?" The evidence clearly shows that Officer Mason's actions were not consistent with proper police procedure or constitutional requirements, Sterling replied. Stopping and arresting a citizen requires reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Walking down a public sidewalk while black does not meet that standard. As the press conference continued, Isaiah was meeting with community leaders and civil rights organizations who had traveled to Charleston to offer their support. The conference room at his law office was packed with representatives from the NAACP, the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and several local advocacy groups. Dr. Michael Washington, the state president of the NAACP, was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s who had been fighting civil rights battles since the 1970s. His gray beard and thoughtful manner commanded respect from everyone in the room. "Senator Davis," Dr. Washington said, "what happened to you yesterday happens to members of our community every day. The difference is that you have the platform and the resources to fight back. We want to make sure that this case becomes a catalyst for broader change." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate all of your support, but I want to be clear about something. This fight isn't just about getting justice for what happened to me. It's about creating a system where every citizen can walk down the street without fear of being harassed by law enforcement." Attorney Janet Morrison from the ACLU leaned forward in her chair. "Senator, our organization has been tracking cases like yours across the state. What happened to you fits a pattern that we've been documenting for years." She opened a laptop and showed the group a presentation filled with statistics and case studies. In Charleston alone, African American men are 3 times more likely to be arrested for disorderly conduct than white men, despite representing only 30% of the population. The numbers suggest systematic bias in enforcement. Isaiah studied the data, his anger growing with each statistic. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," Morrison replied. "But proving it has been difficult because most victims don't have the resources to challenge their arrests. Cases get pled out quietly, complaints get dismissed, and the pattern continues." Reverend Anthony Brown from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a powerful man with graying temples and intense brown eyes, spoke up from the back of the room. "Senator, this is bigger than Charleston. What happened to you could be the spark that ignites a statewide movement for police accountability." Isaiah looked around the room at the faces of people who had dedicated their lives to fighting injustice. "Then let's make sure we don't waste this opportunity. I want to propose legislation that requires body cameras for all officers, creates an independent oversight board for police misconduct, and establishes mandatory bias training for all law enforcement personnel." The room buzzed with excitement as the group began discussing the details of a comprehensive reform package. But Isaiah knew that legislation alone wouldn't be enough. Real change would require shifting the culture within law enforcement, breaking down the wall of silence that protected bad officers and creating consequences severe enough to deter future misconduct. As the meeting continued, Detective Morrison was conducting her own investigation into Mason's history with the department. What she discovered was deeply troubling, a pattern of complaints that had been systematically ignored or dismissed, often with the tacit approval of supervisors who valued Mason's arrest numbers more than his methods. She pulled the files on Mason's previous assignments and found similar patterns everywhere he had worked. In his first precinct, complaints about aggressive behavior and racial bias had led to his transfer rather than discipline. In his second assignment, he had been moved again after a particularly egregious incident involving a black teenager who had been beaten during an arrest. Each time, the department had chosen the path of least resistance, moving Mason to a new area rather than addressing his behavior directly. It was a practice that Morrison realized was endemic throughout the force, a way of managing problem officers without actually solving the underlying issues. Her phone rang, interrupting her research. "Morrison speaking. Detective, this is Agent Sarah Collins with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. I understand you've been investigating Officer Mason's conduct in the Davis arrest. Morrison's pulse quickened. Federal involvement meant that this case would receive the kind of scrutiny that the department had been avoiding for years. Yes, Agent Collins. How can I help you? We'd like to schedule an interview with you regarding your findings. And, Detective Morrison, we're particularly interested in any patterns you may have identified in Officer Mason's arrest record. As Morrison agreed to meet with the FBI, she realized that Mason's arrest of Isaiah Davis had opened a door that would be impossible to close. The investigation was no longer just about one incident. It was about examining years of systematic abuse and the department's failure to address it. Mason, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. As news of the criminal charges broke, he sat in his living room watching his career and reputation disintegrate in real time. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters seeking comment, but his lawyer had instructed him to remain silent. His wife, Carol, had taken their children to stay with her sister, unable to face the neighborhood gossip and media attention that was sure to follow. Mason was alone in his house, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was falling apart because of his own prejudice and arrogance. As the sun set on the second day since Isaiah's arrest, the battle lines were being drawn. On one side stood a coalition of civil rights organizations, community leaders, and federal investigators determined to expose and reform a corrupt system. On the other side was a police department scrambling to protect its reputation, and an officer whose racism had finally caught up with him. The war for accountability was just beginning, and Isaiah Davis was ready to lead the charge. The federal courthouse in Charleston had seen many high-profile cases over the years, but few had generated the level of public interest and media attention as United States versus Kevin Mason. The limestone building, with its imposing columns and wide steps, had become a gathering place for protesters, supporters, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness what many were calling a landmark case in police accountability. Inside courtroom 4A, Judge Harold Stone surveyed the packed gallery with the weary expression of someone who had presided over contentious cases for the better part of 3 decades. Stone was known for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for theatrics from either side, but even he seemed affected by the gravity of the case before him. The prosecution table was occupied by federal prosecutor Angela Rivers, a formidable woman in her early 50s who had built her career prosecuting civil rights violations. Rivers had sharp brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and wore her natural hair in a style that spoke of confidence and competence. Beside her sat her assistant, a young attorney named Marcus Webb, who had been hand-picked for his expertise in police misconduct cases. At the defense table, Mason sat hunched forward, his civilian clothes a stark contrast to the uniform he had worn with such pride just weeks before. His legal team consisted of 3 attorneys hired by the police union, led by veteran criminal defense lawyer Richard Hayes, a silver-haired man known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to create reasonable doubt, even in seemingly hopeless cases. Judge Stone called the court to order, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here for the arraignment of Kevin Mason on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest, and filing false official statements. Mr. Mason, please stand. Mason rose shakily to his feet, his face pale and drawn. The confident officer who had swaggered through the streets of Charleston was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood the consequences of his actions. "How do you plead to the charges?" Judge Stone asked. Hayes stood beside his client, his voice firm and clear. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor." The plea was expected, but it still sent a ripple of murmurs through the packed gallery. Isaiah sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, his expression calm but watchful. Beside him sat Denise Franklin, who was representing him in the related civil lawsuit that had been filed against both Mason and the Charleston Police Department. Judge Stone set a trial date for 6 weeks out, a relatively quick timeline that reflected the high-profile nature of the case. Mr. Hayes, I trust your client understands the seriousness of these charges? Yes, Your Honor, Hayes replied. Officer Mason maintains his innocence and looks forward to presenting his case to a jury. As the arraignment concluded, the media scrum outside the courthouse was intense. Rivers faced a wall of cameras and microphones, her statement brief but pointed. The federal government is committed to ensuring that all citizens receive equal protection under the law, she said, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd noise. When law enforcement officers abuse their authority to violate constitutional rights, they will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Mason's defense team took a different approach, with Hayes attempting to frame the case as a rush to judgment driven by political pressure rather than facts. Officer Mason is a dedicated public servant who has spent 10 years protecting the citizens of Charleston, Hayes declared to the assembled media. We intend to prove that his actions were justified and that he has become a scapegoat in a politically charged atmosphere. But even as Hayes spoke, more evidence was emerging that undermined Mason's position. Detective Morrison had continued her investigation and had uncovered additional cases that showed a clear pattern of racial bias in Mason's enforcement activities. Working late into the evening in her cluttered office, Morrison spread arrest records across her desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. What emerged was a disturbing picture of systematic targeting that went far beyond the Davis incident. She had identified 37 arrests made by Mason over the past 3 years, where the charges were later dismissed or reduced significantly, suggesting that the initial arrests were without merit. Of those 37 cases, 31 involved African American defendants, a statistical anomaly that would be difficult to explain away as coincidence. Her phone rang, interrupting her analysis. Morrison speaking. Detective, this is Agent Collins from the FBI. We've completed our preliminary review of the evidence you provided, and we'd like to expand our investigation. Morrison leaned back in her chair, unsurprised by the development. What are you looking for? We want to examine every arrest Mason has made in the past 5 years, cross-reference them with complaint records, and interview victims who may have been reluctant to come forward previously. Morrison whistled softly. That's going to be a massive undertaking. Yes, it is, Collins agreed. But based on what we've seen so far, we believe this case represents systematic civil rights violations that require federal intervention. As the federal investigation expanded, the Charleston Police Department found itself under unprecedented scrutiny. Officers who had previously felt protected by the blue wall of silence were now worried about their own exposure, and morale throughout the department plummeted. Chief Manning called an emergency meeting of his senior staff, gathering his commanders and supervisors in the department's main conference room. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone aware that their jobs and reputations were on the line. I'll be direct, Manning began, his voice strained from days of crisis management. The FBI is conducting a pattern and practice investigation of our entire department. That means they'll be examining everything: our training protocols, our supervision practices, our complaint procedures, and our use of force policies. Deputy Chief Barbara Reynolds, a tough woman in her 50s who had risen through the ranks during an era when female officers faced significant discrimination, spoke up from the far end of the table. Chief, what's our exposure? How many other officers could be implicated? Manning looked around the table at the faces of his command staff, many of whom he had worked with for years. That depends on how honest we're willing to be about our failures. The Mason case isn't happening in a vacuum. It's the result of a culture that has tolerated discrimination and abuse for too long. Lieutenant Colonel James Anderson, the department's training commander, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sir, our training programs meet all state requirements. We've implemented bias training, de-escalation techniques, and community policing strategies. Training that apparently didn't prevent Mason from racially profiling and arresting a state senator, Manning replied sharply. Jim, I need you to be honest with me. How many other officers have shown signs of the same problems we're seeing with Mason? Anderson was quiet for a long moment, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and measured demeanor. Finally, he spoke. Chief, if we're being completely honest, Mason isn't the only officer with questionable judgment when it comes to interactions with minority citizens. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Manning had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by his training commander made the situation feel even more dire. "Give me names," Manning said. Anderson pulled out a folder he had brought to the meeting. "I've identified 8 officers who have had multiple complaints involving racial bias or excessive force. Most of the complaints were dismissed or resolved through internal discipline, but the patterns are concerning." Deputy Chief Reynolds leaned forward. "What kind of patterns?" "Disproportionate arrest rates for minority citizens, frequent use of disorderly conduct charges that are later dismissed, and complaint rates significantly higher than department average," Anderson replied. Manning felt a chill run down his spine. The federal investigation was likely to uncover all of these cases, and the department's failure to address them proactively would be seen as evidence of institutional racism. "What's our legal strategy?" asked Captain Lisa Rodriguez, the department's legal liaison. "Cooperation," Manning replied immediately. "We're going to provide full access to all records. We're going to discipline officers who have engaged in misconduct, and we're going to implement reforms that address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen." The room was quiet as the command staff absorbed the implications of Manning's decision. Cooperating with the federal investigation meant throwing Mason and potentially other officers under the bus, but it also represented the department's best chance of surviving the scandal with some credibility intact. Lieutenant Anderson spoke up again. "Chief, what about officer morale? The rank and file are already feeling like they're under attack." Manning's expression hardened. "Jim, if our officers are feeling attacked because we're finally holding racist cops accountable, then maybe we need different officers." Meanwhile, in his home office, Isaiah was preparing for what would be the most important testimony of his life. The federal prosecutors had scheduled multiple preparation sessions to review his account of the arrest and anticipate the defense team's likely strategy. Prosecutor Rivers sat across from Isaiah at his dining room table, her laptop open to a detailed timeline of events. "Senator, the defense is going to try to portray this as a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion because of your political position. We need to be ready for that argument." Isaiah nodded, his expression serious. "How do we counter it?" "By focusing on the evidence," Rivers replied. "Mason's behavior was clearly motivated by racial bias, and we have the video footage to prove it. But we also need to show the jury that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of discriminatory enforcement." Marcus Webb looked up from his own notes. "Senator, we've been interviewing other victims of Mason's misconduct, and their stories are remarkably similar to yours. Same targeting of minority citizens, same false charges, same lies in official reports." Isaiah's jaw tightened as he thought about the other people who had suffered at Mason's hands. "How many victims are we talking about?" "Dozens," Rivers replied, "and those are just the ones we've identified so far. We suspect there are many more who were too intimidated or too poor to fight back." The preparation session was interrupted by a knock at the door. Isaiah's assistant announced that Chief Manning was outside, requesting a private meeting. Isaiah looked at Rivers, who nodded her approval. Manning entered the room looking like a man who had aged years in the span of days. His uniform was impeccable as always, but his face showed the strain of managing an unprecedented crisis while trying to preserve what remained of his department's reputation. "Senator Davis," Manning began, his voice formal but respectful, "I want to personally apologize for Officer Mason's conduct and for the department's failure to prevent this incident." Isaiah studied Manning carefully, remembering the hope and optimism he had felt when endorsing the man for police chief 2 years earlier. "Chief Manning, your apology is noted, but what I'm really interested in is what you're going to do to ensure this never happens again." Manning sat down heavily in an offered chair. We're implementing immediate reforms, mandatory body cameras for all officers, revised training protocols, and an independent review board for complaints involving racial bias. That's a start, Isaiah replied. But what about the officers who enabled Mason's behavior? What about the supervisors who ignored 17 complaints? What about the culture that protected him for 10 years? Manning's shoulders sagged slightly. We're conducting a comprehensive review of personnel and practices. Officers who have engaged in similar conduct will face discipline, up to and including termination. Isaiah leaned forward, his voice taking on the commanding tone he used in legislative hearings. Chief, I supported your appointment because I believed you could reform this department. This is your chance to prove that my faith wasn't misplaced. Manning nodded solemnly. I won't let you down again, Senator. As Manning left, Rivers turned to Isaiah with an expression of concern. Are you sure you want to testify? The defense is going to come after you hard, and it won't be pleasant. Isaiah's expression was resolute. Angela, I've faced down enemy fire in Iraq and hostile politicians in Colombia. I'm not about to be intimidated by a racist cop and his lawyers. This is different, Rivers warned. They're going to try to make you the villain, to suggest that you used your position to railroad an innocent officer. Isaiah smiled grimly. Let them try. The truth is on our side, and the evidence is overwhelming. Mason made his choice when he decided to target me because of my race. Now he has to live with the consequences. As the legal teams prepared for battle, the community continued to rally around Isaiah's cause. Protests were organized outside the police station and city hall, demanding not just justice in Mason's case, but comprehensive reforms to prevent future incidents. The story had also caught the attention of national civil rights leaders, who saw it as an opportunity to advance their agenda for police accountability. Reverend Jesse Jackson announced that he would be coming to Charleston to support Isaiah, and other prominent figures were planning similar visits. Mason, isolated in his home and abandoned by many of his former colleagues, was beginning to understand that he had become the face of everything wrong with American policing. His arrest of Isaiah Davis had unleashed forces that would not be satisfied with his conviction alone. They wanted to transform the entire system that had created and protected him. The battle for justice was intensifying, and Mason was about to learn that sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free. Sometimes it destroys everything you thought you knew about power and privilege in America. 6 weeks later, the federal courthouse was surrounded by protesters, media trucks, and police barriers as the trial of Kevin Mason began. The case had become a lightning rod for national discussions about police accountability and racial justice, drawing attention from civil rights organizations, law enforcement groups, and politicians from both sides of the aisle. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The jury selection process had taken 3 days, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for signs of bias either for or against law enforcement. The final panel consisted of 8 women and 4 men, representing a cross-section of Charleston's diverse population. Prosecutor Angela Rivers stood to deliver her opening statement, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. She wore a navy blue suit that projected authority and competence, and her natural hair was styled in a way that commanded respect without appearing confrontational. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Rivers began, this case is about the abuse of power. It's about what happens when a police officer decides that the color of someone's skin is enough justification to stop them, harass them, and ultimately arrest them without cause. She walked closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror as she spoke. The defendant, Kevin Mason, was a sworn police officer entrusted with protecting the constitutional rights of all citizens. Instead, he used his badge and his authority to target Senator Isaiah Davis because he was a black man walking in what Mason considered his territory. Rivers gestured toward the defense table where Mason sat rigidly beside his attorneys. Over the next few days, you will see video evidence of Officer Mason's conduct. You will hear from witnesses who observed his behavior. and you will see how he then compounded his misconduct by filing a false police report that bore no resemblance to what actually occurred. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The defense will try to convince you that this was a misunderstanding, that Officer Mason was simply doing his job. But the evidence will show that this was no misunderstanding. It was a deliberate violation of Senator Davis's constitutional rights, motivated by racial prejudice and enabled by a culture of impunity. Rivers returned to her table, her opening statement having set a tone of moral clarity that would be difficult for the defense to overcome. The gallery was silent, absorbing the weight of her words and the implications for the broader fight against police misconduct. Defense attorney Richard Hayes rose next, his silver hair and expensive suit projecting an image of establishment credibility. Hayes had defended dozens of police officers over his career and knew how to appeal to jurors' instincts to support law enforcement. "Members of the jury," Hayes began, his voice warm and conversational. "What we have here is a tragic misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion by politics and media attention. Officer Kevin Mason is not a racist. He is not a rogue cop. He is a dedicated public servant who made a split-second decision based on his training and experience." Hayes walked toward the jury, his demeanor friendly and approachable. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Officer Mason targeted Senator Davis because of his race. But the evidence will show that Officer Mason had no idea who Senator Davis was when he made the initial contact. He saw suspicious behavior and responded as any reasonable officer would." He gestured toward Mason, whose head was bowed as he stared at the table in front of him. "Kevin Mason has served the Charleston community for 10 years without a single sustained complaint for racial bias. His record shows arrests across all racial lines, proving that he enforces the law equally regardless of color." Hayes's opening statement was smooth and professional, but several jurors seemed skeptical of his claims, particularly given the video evidence they knew would be presented. The defense strategy appeared to be based on convincing the jury that Mason's intent was not discriminatory, even if his actions appeared problematic in hindsight. Rivers called her first witness, Jerome Washington, who had observed the entire incident from start to finish. Jerome walked to the witness stand with the dignity of a man who had been waiting months to tell his story to a jury. "Mr. Washington," Rivers began, "please tell the jury what you observed on the afternoon of Senator Davis's arrest." Jerome's voice was steady as he recounted the incident, his testimony devastating to Mason's defense. "I saw Officer Mason watching Senator Davis for several minutes before approaching him. The senator was just walking to choir practice, same as he does every Thursday. There was nothing suspicious about his behavior." Hayes objected repeatedly during Jerome's testimony, trying to prevent the jury from hearing details that painted Mason in a negative light. But Judge Stone overruled most of the objections, allowing Jerome to provide a complete account of what he had witnessed. "Did you hear Officer Mason make any statements that struck you as inappropriate?" Rivers asked. Jerome nodded gravely. "He said 'you people' multiple times, and when Senator Davis asked why he was being stopped, Mason said something about knowing his type. It was clear that the officer was treating Senator Davis differently because he was black." Hayes stood for cross-examination. His strategy focused on undermining Jerome's credibility and suggesting that his friendship with Isaiah had biased his perception of events. "Mr. Washington, you attend the same church as Senator Davis, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you've known him for many years?" "Since we were children." Hayes smiled as if Jerome had just proved his point. "So you have a personal relationship with the alleged victim in this case. Wouldn't that relationship affect your objectivity?" Jerome's expression didn't change. "My relationship with Senator Davis doesn't change what I saw that day. Officer Mason harassed an innocent man because of his race, and I watched it happen." Hayes pressed on, trying to create doubt about Jerome's testimony. "Mr. Washington, you weren't close enough to hear everything that was said, were you? Isn't it possible that you misunderstood the context of Officer Mason's statements?" "I was close enough. Jerome replied firmly. And I understood perfectly. Officer Mason was treating Senator Davis like a criminal from the moment he approached him. Rivers called several more witnesses throughout the day, each one providing testimony that supported the prosecution's case. Maria Gonzalez described her own encounters with Mason, painting a picture of an officer who routinely targeted minority citizens for harassment. David Thompson testified about being detained for over an hour, despite clearly not matching the description of any suspect Mason was supposedly seeking. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Rebecca Johnson, a forensic psychologist who had reviewed Mason's arrest patterns and complaint history. Dr. Johnson was a respected expert who had testified in dozens of cases involving police misconduct, and her analysis was methodical and damning. Based on my review of Officer Mason's arrest records, Dr. Johnson testified, there is clear evidence of disparate impact on minority citizens. The statistical probability that this pattern occurred by chance is less than 1%. Hayes fought hard during cross-examination to discredit Dr. Johnson's analysis, but her credentials and methodology were solid. The jury listened intently as she explained how Mason's behavior fit established patterns of racially biased policing. Dr. Johnson, Rivers asked during redirect examination, in your expert opinion, was Officer Mason's interaction with Senator Davis consistent with professional police procedure? Absolutely not, Dr. Johnson replied without hesitation. Officer Mason's approach, his escalation of the encounter, and his ultimate decision to arrest Senator Davis all violated basic principles of constitutional policing. As the first day of testimony concluded, Mason looked like a man who was watching his life disintegrate in real time. His union representatives huddled with his legal team in the hallway outside the courtroom, their expressions grim as they discussed strategy for the following day. Mason himself remained silent, his face a mask of defeat and growing desperation. The confident officer who had believed himself untouchable was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood that his actions had consequences. Outside the courthouse, Isaiah addressed the media with the same calm authority he had displayed throughout the ordeal. Today, the jury heard testimony about a pattern of behavior that extends far beyond my arrest. This trial is not just about holding one officer accountable, it's about changing a system that has failed too many people for too long. Denise Franklin stood beside him, her expression reflecting satisfaction with the day's proceedings. The evidence presented today clearly shows that Officer Mason's actions were motivated by racial bias and violated federal civil rights laws. We're confident that justice will be served. As the crowd dispersed, Isaiah remained on the courthouse steps for a moment, looking up at the building where his case was being heard. He thought about all the people who had suffered similar injustices but had never had the opportunity to seek accountability. This trial was for them as much as it was for him. Mason drove home alone that evening, his wife and children still staying with relatives to avoid the media attention. His house felt empty and cold, a reflection of the isolation that had become his new reality. Former colleagues avoided his calls, neighbors crossed the street to avoid conversations, and his once bright future had been reduced to hoping for a plea deal that might keep him out of prison. He sat in his darkened living room, staring at the television where legal analysts were discussing his case and predicting his conviction. For the first time since the arrest, Mason began to truly understand the impact of his actions, not just on Isaiah Davis, but on his own family, his colleagues, and the community he had sworn to serve. The trial would continue for several more days, with each piece of evidence building toward what seemed like an inevitable conclusion. But Mason still had his defense team, his union support, and a slim hope that the jury might find reasonable doubt in the chaos of competing narratives. He had no idea that the worst was yet to come, and that his arrest of Isaiah Davis had set in motion events that would expose corruption and racism throughout the Charleston Police Department. The truth was coming, and it would be more devastating than anyone had imagined. The second day of trial began with a bombshell that no one in the courtroom had seen coming. Prosecutor Angela Rivers stood before Judge Stone with a manila folder in her hands and an expression that suggested she was about to drop a nuclear weapon into the proceedings. "Your Honor," Rivers announced, "the government has obtained additional evidence that we believe is crucial to this case. We request permission to present testimony from Detective Lisa Morrison of the Charleston Police Department." Defense attorney Richard Hayes shot to his feet, his face flushed with alarm. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not on the prosecution's witness list. We've had no opportunity to prepare for cross-examination." Judge Stone leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Rivers, this is highly irregular. What is the nature of Detective Morrison's testimony?" Rivers's voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of excitement. "Your Honor, Detective Morrison has uncovered evidence of a pattern of discriminatory enforcement by the defendant that directly relates to his state of mind during the incident involving Senator Davis." Mason's face went white as he realized what was happening. Morrison had been collecting evidence against him for weeks, and now it was all going to come out in front of the jury, the media, and the world. Hayes tried desperately to block the testimony. "Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to introduce prejudicial evidence that has no bearing on the specific charges in this case." Judge Stone was quiet for several minutes, weighing the legal arguments. Finally, he spoke. "I'll allow the testimony, but with strict limitations. Detective Morrison may testify only about evidence directly related to the defendant's pattern of behavior toward minority citizens." Morrison took the stand with the confidence of someone who had been waiting months to tell this story. She was wearing her dress uniform, her badge and commendations visible to the jury, lending credibility to her testimony before she even spoke. Rivers approached the witness stand carefully, knowing that Morrison's testimony could make or break the case. "Detective Morrison, as part of your investigation into this case, did you review Officer Mason's arrest records?" "Yes, I did," Morrison replied, her voice clear and professional. "I reviewed all of Officer Mason's arrests over the past 5 years, along with complaint records and witness statements." "What did your analysis reveal?" Morrison turned to face the jury directly. "It revealed a clear pattern of disparate enforcement targeting African American citizens. Officer Mason arrested black males at a rate 3 times higher than the department average, despite patrolling areas with similar demographic compositions to other officers." Hayes objected strenuously, but Judge Stone allowed the testimony to continue. Morrison's analysis was methodical and devastating, showing not just statistical disparities, but specific cases where Mason had arrested black citizens on charges that were later dismissed for lack of evidence. "Detective Morrison," Rivers continued, "did you find evidence that Officer Mason had received complaints about similar behavior in the past?" Morrison nodded gravely. "Yes. Over the past 5 years, Officer Mason received 17 formal complaints alleging racial bias, excessive force, or inappropriate conduct. 16 of those complaints involved African American citizens." The courtroom stirred with murmurs as the significance of this revelation sank in. Mason's defense team had spent weeks arguing that their client was a dedicated officer without a history of misconduct, but Morrison's testimony was systematically destroying that narrative. "What happened to those complaints?" Rivers asked. Morrison's expression grew troubled. "All 17 were dismissed by Internal Affairs without sustained findings. In 12 cases, the complainants withdrew their complaints or stopped cooperating with the investigation." Hayes objected vigorously. "Your Honor, this testimony is prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific charges against my client." Judge Stone overruled the objection. "The defendant's pattern of behavior is relevant to his state of mind and intent. Continue, Detective Morrison." Rivers approached the witness stand with a document in her hand. "Detective Morrison, I'm showing you what's been marked as Government Exhibit 15. Can you identify this document?" Morrison examined the paper carefully. "This is a complaint filed against Officer Mason by David Thompson in March of last year. Mr. Thompson alleged that Officer Mason detained him for over an hour. despite his clearly not matching the description of any suspect. What was the resolution of this complaint? It was dismissed after Mr. Thompson stopped responding to internal affairs investigators. Rivers turned to face the jury. Detective Morrison, based on your investigation, do you have an opinion about why so many complainants stopped cooperating with internal affairs? Morrison hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to reveal. Based on interviews I conducted, several complainants reported being contacted by other officers who suggested that pursuing their complaints would result in increased scrutiny of their own activities. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Stone banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order as the implications of Morrison's testimony sank in. The suggestion that police officers had intimidated citizens to prevent them from filing complaints was explosive, and it painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond Mason's individual actions. Mason slumped in his chair, his face a mask of defeat. His own colleague was systematically destroying his defense, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Hayes whispered urgently in his ear, but Mason seemed barely aware of his surroundings. Rivers continued her examination, methodically building a case that Mason's arrest of Isaiah was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of discriminatory behavior that had been ignored and covered up by the department. Detective Morrison, in your professional opinion, was Officer Mason's approach to Senator Davis consistent with standard police procedure? No, Morrison replied without hesitation. Officer Mason conducted surveillance of Senator Davis for over 20 minutes without any indication of criminal activity. His initial contact was confrontational rather than investigative, and his escalation to arrest was not supported by any evidence of wrongdoing. During cross-examination, Hayes attempted to discredit Morrison's testimony by suggesting that she was biased against Mason due to departmental politics. But Morrison's credentials and reputation for integrity made his attacks ineffective. Detective Morrison, Hayes said, his tone slightly aggressive, isn't it true that you and Officer Mason have had professional disagreements in the past? Morrison met his gaze steadily. Mr. Hayes, my disagreements with Officer Mason were based on his conduct, not personal animosity. I've witnessed him treat citizens inappropriately on multiple occasions, and I regret not speaking up sooner. Hayes's face showed frustration as he realized that Morrison's honesty was making her more credible, not less. You regret not speaking up? Yes, Morrison said firmly. I should have reported Officer Mason's behavior years ago. My failure to act allowed him to continue harassing innocent citizens, and I take responsibility for that. The honesty and self-reflection in Morrison's testimony was powerful, and several jurors nodded approvingly at her willingness to acknowledge her own mistakes. The afternoon session brought even more damaging evidence against Mason. Rivers presented the video footage from multiple angles, each one showing clearly that Isaiah had been calm and cooperative throughout the encounter. The jury watched in silence as Mason berated Isaiah, kicked his belongings, and made statements that could only be interpreted as racially motivated. When the prosecution played the audio of Mason saying, "You people think you can just do whatever you want," several jurors visibly reacted with disgust. The defense table looked increasingly desperate as each piece of evidence reinforced the prosecution's narrative of racial bias and abuse of power. Rivers also presented evidence of Mason's false police report, showing point by point how his written account contradicted the video evidence. Where Mason claimed Isaiah had been aggressive and threatening, the video showed a man who remained calm even while being humiliated. Where Mason claimed Isaiah had reached toward his weapon, the video showed no such movement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Rivers said as she presented the comparison, this is not a case of competing interpretations of the same events. This is a case of deliberate falsification of official records to cover up constitutional violations. As the day's testimony concluded, Isaiah sat in the gallery reflecting on what he had heard. Morrison's testimony had been particularly powerful because it came from within the law enforcement community itself. Her willingness to acknowledge the department's failures and her own complicity gave credibility to the prosecution's case that no outside expert could provide. Mason's wife, Carol, sat in the back row, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the evidence against her husband. She had defended him initially, convinced that the charges were politically motivated, but the mounting evidence was impossible to ignore, and she was beginning to accept that the man she had married was not who she thought he was. During a brief recess, Carol approached Isaiah in the hallway outside the courtroom. Her face was red with embarrassment and shame as she struggled to find words. "Senator Davis," she said quietly, "I want you to know that not everyone in Kevin's family supports what he did. I'm ashamed of his behavior and I'm sorry for what you went through." Isaiah looked at her with compassion, recognizing the pain of someone whose world had been turned upside down by events beyond her control. "Mrs. Mason, I appreciate your words. I know this has been difficult for your family as well." Carol nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. "Our children are asking questions I don't know how to answer. How do I explain to them that their father is a racist?" "Maybe," Isaiah replied gently, "you start by helping them understand that people can change and that acknowledging mistakes is the first step toward redemption." As Carol walked away, Denise Franklin joined Isaiah in the hallway. "That was kind of you," she said. "Not everyone would show compassion to the family of the man who wronged them." Isaiah shrugged. "Carol Mason didn't arrest me. Her husband did. She's a victim of his choices, too, in her own way." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of FBI agent Sarah Collins, who had been monitoring the trial closely as part of the broader federal investigation into the Charleston Police Department. Collins was a tall, athletic woman in her late 30s with short brown hair and the kind of intense focus that made criminals nervous. "Senator Davis," Collins said, approaching with a serious expression, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Isaiah nodded and followed Collins to a small conference room near the courthouse's main entrance. Denise accompanied them, her legal instincts telling her that this conversation could be significant. "Senator," Collins began, "our investigation has uncovered evidence that Officer Mason's misconduct was known to his supervisors and that complaints against him were systematically dismissed or buried." Isaiah leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What kind of evidence?" Collins opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. Internal emails between Mason's sergeant and internal affairs investigators discussing strategies to discredit complainants. Disciplinary recommendations that were overturned by higher-ranking officers, and most significantly, evidence that Mason received preferential treatment because of his arrest numbers. Denise examined the documents, her eyes widening as she read. "This suggests a conspiracy to protect Mason despite known misconduct." "That's exactly what it suggests," Collins confirmed. "We believe that multiple officers and supervisors could face federal charges for their role in enabling Mason's behavior." Isaiah sat back in his chair, processing the implications. "How high up does this go?" "We're still investigating," Collins replied, "but it appears that several command-level officers were aware of Mason's problems and chose to transfer him rather than discipline him. The revelation that Mason's supervisors had actively protected him despite knowing about his misconduct added a new dimension to the case. It suggested that the problem wasn't just one rogue officer, but a systemic failure that reached deep into the department's command structure. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session brought testimony from Isaiah himself. As he walked to the witness stand, the gallery fell silent, every person present aware that they were about to hear from the man at the center of the storm. Rivers began her direct examination with basic questions about Isaiah's background, establishing his credentials as both a community leader and a decorated military veteran. The jury listened intently as Isaiah described his service in Iraq, his work as a state senator, and his 15 years as a choir director at Mount Calvary Baptist Church. "Senator Davis," Rivers said, "please tell the jury about your encounter with Officer Mason." Isaiah's voice was calm and measured as he recounted the incident, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and clear delivery. He described Mason's initial approach, the escalating hostility, and the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of his community. "Did you threaten Officer Mason in any way?" Rivers asked. "No," Isaiah replied firmly. "I told him that I would file a complaint about his conduct, which is my constitutional right. If Officer Mason interpreted that as a threat, it says more about his state of mind than mine." Rivers walked closer to the jury box. "Senator Davis, you've served in combat and worked in politics for many years. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt more helpless than you did during your arrest?" Isaiah considered the question carefully before answering. "In combat, you know who your enemies are and why they're trying to hurt you. In politics, disagreements are based on policy differences, not personal hatred. What I experienced with Officer Mason was different. It was hatred based solely on the color of my skin, and it was backed by the power of the state." The impact of Isaiah's words was visible on the jury's faces. Several jurors looked toward Mason with expressions of disgust, while others seemed moved by the dignity with which Isaiah was handling such a traumatic experience. Hayes's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to suggest that Isaiah was using his political position to gain sympathy, but Isaiah's calm responses and obvious sincerity made the attacks backfire. "Senator Davis," Hayes said, his tone slightly mocking, "isn't it convenient that a man with your resources and connections happened to be the victim of this alleged misconduct?" Isaiah's expression didn't change. "Mr. Hayes, there was nothing convenient about being handcuffed and humiliated in front of my community. If you're suggesting that I somehow orchestrated this incident for political gain, I find that suggestion both offensive and absurd." Hayes pressed on, trying to create doubt about Isaiah's account. "Senator, you've been in politics for many years. Isn't it possible that you're exaggerating Officer Mason's behavior for dramatic effect?" Isaiah leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a steely edge. "Mr. Hayes, I didn't need to exaggerate anything. Officer Mason's behavior speaks for itself, and it's all captured on video for the jury to see." The cross-examination continued for over an hour, but Hayes made little headway against Isaiah's credibility. The senator's calm demeanor and consistent answers contrasted sharply with Mason's nervous fidgeting and obvious distress. As Isaiah stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecution's case looked overwhelming. The video evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis had created a comprehensive picture of racial bias and abuse of power that would be difficult for any jury to ignore. Mason's defense team huddled during a brief recess, their faces grim as they discussed their dwindling options. Hayes knew that his client was in serious trouble, but professional obligation required him to mount the best defense possible. "Kevin," Hayes said quietly, "we need to seriously consider a plea agreement. The evidence against you is substantial, and the jury seems hostile." Mason shook his head stubbornly. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do wrong. I was doing my job." Hayes exchanged glances with his co-counsel, both of them recognizing the denial and delusion that often characterized clients facing overwhelming evidence. "Kevin, your job doesn't include arresting people for being black. The sooner you accept that, the better chance we have of minimizing the damage." But Mason remained defiant, convinced that he was the victim of a political witch hunt rather than the perpetrator of a civil rights violation. His inability to acknowledge the reality of his situation would ultimately seal his fate and ensure that the full weight of the law would fall upon him. As the trial recessed for the day, protesters gathered outside the courthouse for a candlelight vigil in support of Isaiah and other victims of police misconduct. The crowd had grown larger each day, with people traveling from across the state to show their solidarity. Isaiah addressed the crowd briefly, his words carried by speakers set up on the courthouse steps. Today, the jury heard the truth about what happened that afternoon. But more importantly, they heard about a pattern of behavior that has affected dozens of families in our community. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces illuminated by candles and streetlights. This trial is not just about holding one officer accountable. It's about sending a message that abuse of power will not be tolerated, that racial bias has no place in law enforcement, and that every citizen deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The crowd responded with applause and chants of justice for Isaiah that echoed off the courthouse walls. But Isaiah raised his hand for quiet, his expression serious. "However, I want to be clear about something. Our fight for justice must be peaceful and lawful. We cannot fight hatred with hatred. We must fight it with truth, with courage, and with an unwavering commitment to the principles that make America great." As the vigil concluded and the crowd dispersed, Mason sat alone in his lawyer's office, watching news coverage of the day's proceedings. The footage of Morrison's testimony was being played repeatedly, each replay making his situation look more hopeless. His phone buzzed with a text message from his estranged wife. "The kids saw the news at school today. They're asking when Daddy is coming home. I don't know what to tell them." Mason stared at the message for a long time before turning off his phone. For the first time since his arrest of Isaiah Davis, he was beginning to understand that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his own career. His children would grow up knowing that their father was a convicted criminal, his wife would have to rebuild her life without him, and his legacy would be one of hatred and abuse rather than service and protection. The trial would continue for several more days, but the outcome was becoming increasingly clear. Mason had gambled everything on his belief that his badge would protect him from accountability, and he was about to learn just how wrong he had been. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more evidence, and more revelations about the culture of corruption that had enabled his behavior. But tonight, as he sat alone in the darkness of his lawyer's office, Kevin Mason was finally beginning to confront the truth about who he really was and what he had done. The reckoning he had spent years avoiding was finally at hand, and there would be no escape from the consequences of his choices. The third day of trial dawned gray and overcast, with storm clouds gathering over Charleston that seemed to mirror the dark mood inside the federal courthouse. Mason arrived early with his legal team, their faces showing the strain of mounting a defense against overwhelming evidence. The confident swagger that had characterized Mason throughout his career was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man watching his world collapse. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was packed once again with supporters of Isaiah, civil rights activists, and members of the media who sensed that they were witnessing a historic moment in the fight for police accountability. The energy in the room was electric, charged with the anticipation of justice finally being served. Defense attorney Richard Hayes had spent the previous evening strategizing with his team, trying to find any angle that might create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. Their strategy had shifted from denying Mason's misconduct to attempting damage control, acknowledging mistakes while arguing that they didn't rise to the level of federal crimes. Hayes called his first witness, Sergeant Robert Collins, Mason's immediate supervisor for the past 3 years. Collins was a 20-year veteran of the force with a reputation for loyalty to his officers, but as he took the stand, his discomfort was obvious. "Sergeant Collins," Hayes began, "how would you characterize Officer Mason's performance during the time he worked under your supervision?" Collins cleared his throat nervously. "Officer Mason was dedicated to his duties. He had good arrest numbers and responded quickly to calls." Hayes nodded encouragingly. "Did you ever observe Officer Mason engage in racially biased behavior?" Collins hesitated, glancing toward Mason before answering. "Not directly, no." Rivers objected. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness's personal observations are limited and don't address the documented complaints against the defendant." Judge Stone sustained the objection, and Hayes was forced to change his approach. But the damage was already done. Collins's hesitation and qualified answers had made it clear that he wasn't comfortable defending Mason's conduct. Rivers's cross-examination of Collins was devastating. She produced email records showing that Collins had been aware of multiple complaints against Mason, and had recommended that they be dismissed without investigation. "Sergeant Collins," Rivers said, holding up a printed email, "this is a message you sent to Internal Affairs in response to a complaint filed by David Thompson. You wrote, and I quote, 'Thompson has a history of anti-police sentiment, and his complaint lacks credibility. Did you investigate Mr. Thompson's background before making this assessment?' Collins shifted uncomfortably. "I may have made assumptions based on previous interactions." "Previous interactions?" Rivers pressed. "According to our records, you had never encountered Mr. Thompson before he filed his complaint. So what were these assumptions based on?" Collins's silence spoke volumes. The jury could see that he had dismissed Thompson's complaint not based on facts but on prejudice, just as Mason had targeted Isaiah based on racial bias rather than criminal behavior. Rivers continued her methodical destruction of the defense case. "Sergeant Collins, you also wrote that Mason was proactive in addressing potential criminal activity in high-crime areas. Can you explain what you meant by that?" Collins looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Officer Mason was vigilant about suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity like walking while black?" Rivers asked pointedly. Hayes objected, but the question had already made its impact. Collins's obvious discomfort with defending Mason's actions was undermining the defense's argument that the officer had acted appropriately. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from FBI agent Collins, who presented evidence of the broader pattern of misconduct within the Charleston Police Department. Her analysis showed that Mason's behavior was not an anomaly, but part of a culture that tolerated and even encouraged discriminatory enforcement. "Agent Collins," Rivers asked, "based on your investigation, was Officer Mason's treatment of Senator Davis consistent with how he had treated other African-American citizens?" "Yes," Collins replied. "We identified a clear pattern of targeting minority citizens for pretextual stops, escalating minor encounters into arrests, and filing reports that mischaracterized the citizens' behavior to justify the officer's actions." The agent's testimony was supported by a PowerPoint presentation that showed statistical evidence of Mason's discriminatory enforcement patterns. The data was compelling and professional, presented by someone whose credibility couldn't be questioned. Mason watched the presentation with growing horror, realizing that his entire career was being dissected and exposed as a pattern of systematic racism. Every arrest, every report, every interaction was being analyzed and found wanting. Hayes attempted to challenge Agent Collins's methodology during cross-examination, but her analysis was thorough and her conclusions were supported by overwhelming statistical evidence. The defense's attacks came across as desperate attempts to discredit facts that were impossible to dispute. As the afternoon wore on, Hayes made the decision to put Mason on the stand in his own defense. It was a risky strategy, but with the prosecution's case looking so strong, dramatic action was needed to create any chance of reasonable doubt. Mason approached the witness stand with obvious reluctance, his hands shaking as he took the oath. His voice was barely audible as he answered the preliminary questions about his identity and background. Hayes tried to humanize his client, asking about Mason's family, his years of service, and his commitment to public safety, but Mason's responses were wooden and unconvincing, delivered by a man who seemed to be fighting internal battles as much as external ones. "Officer Mason," Hayes said, "please tell the jury about your encounter with Senator Davis." Mason's account was a reiteration of his police report, but delivered with none of the confidence he had shown in his written statement. His voice wavered as he described approaching Isaiah, and he avoided eye contact with the jury as he repeated his claims about threatening behavior and reaching for his weapon. "Did you know that, mister?" Davis was a state senator when you arrested him? Hayes asked. No, Mason replied. I had no idea who he was. Hayes seized on this point. So your actions couldn't have been motivated by any desire to target him because of his political position? That's correct, Mason said, though his answer rang hollow in the face of all the evidence about his targeting of African American citizens. Rivers's cross-examination of Mason was masterful, systematically dismantling his testimony while exposing the contradictions and lies that had characterized his account from the beginning. She began by showing Mason still frames from the video evidence, asking him to explain how his written report could be so different from what the cameras had captured. Officer Mason, Rivers said, pointing to an image of Isaiah standing calmly with his hands visible. You wrote in your report that Senator Davis was agitated and threatening. Can you explain how this image supports that description? Mason stared at the screen, unable to reconcile his written account with the visual evidence. The image doesn't show everything. There was context that the cameras didn't capture. What context? Rivers pressed. What happened immediately before this image was taken that justified your characterization of Senator Davis as threatening? Mason's silence stretched on for nearly a minute as he struggled to find an answer that wouldn't further incriminate him. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I felt threatened by his attitude. Rivers moved closer to the witness stand. His attitude. Officer Mason, Senator Davis, asked you a simple question about why he was being stopped. Since when is asking questions considered threatening behavior? Mason's composure finally cracked. Look, I've been doing this job for 10 years. I know how to spot trouble, and this guy was trouble from the moment I saw him. The courtroom fell silent at Mason's outburst. His mask had finally slipped, revealing the prejudice and arrogance that had motivated his actions. Rivers had gotten exactly what she was looking for, an admission that Mason had prejudged Isaiah before any interaction had taken place. Officer Mason, Rivers said calmly, when you say Senator Davis was trouble from the moment you saw him, what exactly did you see that led you to that conclusion? Mason realized too late that he had walked into a trap. Any answer he gave would either admit to racial profiling or force him to fabricate a justification that could be easily disproven. He was in an area where we'd had problems before, Mason stammered. Rivers consulted her notes. Actually, according to crime statistics for that area, there had been no reports of criminal activity near the community center for over 6 months. So what problems were you referring to? Mason's face reddened as he realized he had been caught in another lie. I meant general problems. You know, the usual issues we deal with in that neighborhood. What usual issues? Rivers pressed. Drug dealing, vandalism, theft? Can you be specific about what crimes you were concerned about? Mason's mouth opened and closed without sound. He couldn't specify crimes because there had been none. His targeting of Isaiah had been based purely on racial prejudice, and Rivers had just forced him to admit it in front of the jury. Hayes tried to rehabilitate his client during redirect examination, but the damage was done. Mason's testimony had contradicted his earlier statements, exposed his racial bias, and revealed the lack of any legitimate law enforcement justification for his actions. But Mason had chosen a different path, one that led inevitably to his destruction. His legacy would not be one of service and protection, but of hatred and abuse. He had become a symbol of everything wrong with American policing, and his name would forever be associated with the kind of racism that the civil rights movement had fought so hard to overcome. The reforms implemented in Charleston had ripple effects throughout the state and beyond. Other police departments, fearing federal scrutiny and community backlash, began implementing similar accountability measures. Isaiah's police accountability bill, which had stalled in the legislature before his arrest, passed unanimously just 6 months after Mason's conviction. Isaiah himself had emerged from the ordeal as a national figure in the fight for civil rights and police reform. He was invited to speak at conferences and universities across the country, sharing his story and advocating for the systemic changes needed to prevent future abuses. But perhaps more importantly, he had returned to his role as choir director with a renewed sense of purpose. The music that filled Mount Calvary Baptist Church on Thursday evenings carried new meaning now, songs of justice, hope, and redemption that spoke to a community that had been tested but not broken. During one particularly moving practice session, the choir was working on a new arrangement of "We Shall Overcome" when Isaiah paused the music to address his singers. "This song has special meaning for our community now," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had fought and won a difficult battle. "We've seen what happens when good people stand together against injustice. We've seen that the truth really can set us free." Keisha Roberts, who sang alto in the choir and had been one of Isaiah's most vocal supporters during the trial, raised her hand. "Brother Isaiah, my teenage son asked me something the other day that I couldn't answer. He wanted to know if what happened to you could happen to him." Isaiah set down his conductor's baton and faced the choir directly. "Keisha, you tell your son that we've made progress, but we haven't solved the problem completely. The difference now is that we know we can fight back. We know that accountability is possible, and we know that our voices matter." The conversation continued as choir members shared their own stories and concerns about police interactions in their community. What emerged was a picture of a community that had been transformed by adversity, made stronger by standing together against injustice. Detective Morrison, who had become a regular participant in community meetings since the trial, spoke about the changes within the police department. "The Mason case was a wake-up call for all of us," she said. "It forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our culture and practices. Change is happening, but it requires constant vigilance." The federal investigation into the Charleston Police Department had resulted in a consent decree requiring ongoing federal oversight of the department's practices. 7 additional officers had been disciplined or terminated, and the department's entire training curriculum had been overhauled to emphasize constitutional policing and bias recognition. Chief Manning, who had survived the scandal but whose reputation had been permanently damaged, announced his retirement 6 months after Mason's sentencing. In his farewell address to the department, he acknowledged the failures that had occurred under his leadership and expressed hope that his successor would build on the reforms that had been implemented. "The Mason case taught us that good intentions are not enough," Manning said to the assembled officers. "We must be willing to confront racism and misconduct wherever we find it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it involves our colleagues." His replacement was Captain Barbara Reynolds, who became Charleston's first African-American police chief. Reynolds had been instrumental in implementing the reforms mandated by the federal consent decree, and her appointment was seen as a symbol of the department's commitment to change. At Reynolds' swearing-in ceremony, Isaiah delivered remarks that focused on the future rather than the past. "Chief Reynolds represents a new era for the Charleston Police Department," he said to the gathered crowd, "an era where accountability is not just expected, but demanded, where service truly means serving all citizens equally." The ceremony was held at the same community center where Mason had arrested Isaiah, a deliberate choice that symbolized the transformation that had taken place. The building that had once been the site of injustice had become a symbol of redemption and hope. Among the attendees was Jerome Washington, who had been appointed to the new Civilian Oversight Board that would monitor police conduct and investigate complaints. His presence on the board ensured that the community would have a strong voice in holding officers accountable. "I never thought I'd be working alongside police officers," Jerome said during his remarks at the ceremony, "but the Mason case taught us that change is possible when people of good faith come together to fight for what's right." The event also featured remarks from FBI agent Sarah Collins, who announced that the federal investigation had been expanded to other departments across the state based on evidence uncovered during the Charleston probe. The conviction of Kevin Mason and the reforms implemented in Charleston are just the beginning, Collins said. "We are committed to ensuring that civil rights violations are prosecuted aggressively wherever they occur." As the ceremony concluded, Isaiah found himself approached by a young black police officer named Marcus Johnson, who had joined the Charleston force just months after Mason's conviction. "Senator Davis," Johnson said, his voice filled with admiration, "I wanted to thank you for making it possible for officers like me to serve with pride. Your courage in fighting this case has helped create a department where we can focus on real police work instead of covering for racist colleagues." Isaiah smiled, recognizing in the young officer the hope for a better future. Officer Johnson, the real heroes are people like Detective Morrison, who were willing to speak truth to power from within the system. Your generation of officers has the opportunity to build something better. As the months passed, the story of Isaiah's arrest and Mason's conviction became a case study in law schools and police academies across the country. The incident was analyzed not just as a criminal case, but as an example of how individual courage could catalyze systemic change. Isaiah continued his work in the state legislature, where he had become one of the most influential voices on criminal justice reform. His colleagues, many of whom had previously been reluctant to challenge law enforcement, now looked to him for leadership on police accountability issues. The Isaiah Davis Police Accountability Act, passed 1 year after his arrest, established statewide standards for police conduct, created independent oversight mechanisms, and required comprehensive bias training for all officers. The law became a model for other states struggling with similar issues. Mason's former colleagues watched these developments from the sidelines, many of them reflecting on their own conduct and the culture that had enabled Mason's behavior. Some, like Detective Morrison, embraced the reforms and worked to build a better department. Others retired early or transferred to departments in other states where accountability measures were less stringent. The changes in Charleston extended beyond the police department to the broader community. The arrest had sparked conversations about race and justice that had been overdue for decades, and organizations like the NAACP and local churches found themselves working together on initiatives that addressed the root causes of inequality and discrimination. 2 years after Mason's conviction, Isaiah was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform held in Washington, D.C. The audience included police chiefs, civil rights leaders, federal officials, and academics who were studying the Charleston case as a model for effective reform. "The arrest that changed my life was not just about one racist officer," Isaiah told the packed auditorium. "It was about a system that had forgotten its fundamental purpose, to serve and protect all citizens equally." The reforms we've implemented in Charleston prove that change is possible when communities demand accountability and when good people within law enforcement choose courage over complicity. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, but Isaiah was already thinking about the work that remained to be done. Other Kevin Masons were still out there, protected by departments that prioritized loyalty over justice, and other potential victims were walking the streets unaware that their constitutional rights could be violated at any moment. As Isaiah returned to Charleston after the conference, he drove past the corner where Mason had arrested him 2 years earlier. The spot looked the same buildings, the same sidewalk, the same community center, but everything had changed. Children now played in the area without fear. Citizens walked with confidence, knowing that their rights were protected, and police officers patrolled with the understanding that they were servants of the community, not its masters. That evening, at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, Isaiah led the choir through a new arrangement of Amazing Grace that he had been working on for months. The music filled the sanctuary with hope and redemption, a fitting soundtrack for a community that had been tested by injustice but had emerged stronger and more united. As the final notes faded into silence, Isaiah looked out at the faces of his choir members, people who had stood with him during his darkest hour and had shared in the victory that followed. They had proven that ordinary citizens could hold extraordinary power when they stood together for truth and justice. Mason, meanwhile, remained in federal prison, his days filled with the routine of institutional life and the slow process of confronting the hatred and prejudice that had defined his career. His mandatory counseling sessions had begun to chip away at the wall of denial he had built around his actions, forcing him to acknowledge the pain he had caused and the lives he had damaged. In rare moments of clarity, Mason understood that his arrest of Isaiah Davis had been the inevitable result of years of unchecked racism and abuse. He had been given multiple opportunities to change his behavior, but his arrogance and sense of entitlement had blinded him to the warning signs. Now, stripped of his badge and his freedom, Mason was finally beginning the long journey toward understanding the impact of his actions. Whether he would emerge from prison as a changed man remained to be seen, but his conviction had already served its purpose. It had proven that even police officers were not above the law. The story of Isaiah Davis and Kevin Mason became more than just a criminal case. It became a symbol of hope for communities across America that had been fighting for police accountability for generations. It proved that, with courage, determination, and community support, even the most entrenched systems of discrimination could be challenged and changed. Isaiah's arrest had lasted only a few hours, but its impact would be felt for generations. The truth had indeed found a way, just as he had promised it would, and justice had finally been served. The fight for equality and accountability would continue, but the victory in Charleston had shown that progress was possible when good people refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. Mason had underestimated Isaiah Davis, and in doing so, he had underestimated the power of truth itself. The racist cop who thought he could silence a choir director had instead awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had roared back with the full force of American justice behind it. 3 months after the guilty verdict, Kevin Mason stood before Judge Harold Stone for sentencing, a broken man bearing little resemblance to the arrogant officer who had arrested Isaiah Davis on that fateful Thursday afternoon. The courtroom was once again packed, but the atmosphere was different now, less charged with anger and more focused on the solemn business of justice. Mason had lost significant weight during his time awaiting sentencing, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. His wife had filed for divorce, taking their children and moving to another state to escape the stigma of his conviction. His former colleagues had abandoned him completely, and he had become a pariah in the law enforcement community that had once been his entire identity. Judge Stone reviewed the pre-sentence report carefully, his expression grave as he considered the appropriate punishment for Mason's crimes. The federal sentencing guidelines called for a prison term of 3 to 5 years, but the judge had discretion to consider both aggravating and mitigating factors. "Mr. Mason," Judge Stone said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "please stand for sentencing." Mason rose unsteadily to his feet, his court-appointed attorney placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. Hayes had withdrawn from the case after the conviction, citing ethical concerns about Mason's continued denial of wrongdoing. "Mr. Mason," the judge continued, "you have been convicted of serious federal crimes that strike at the heart of our constitutional system. As a police officer, you swore an oath to protect and serve all citizens equally. Instead, you used your authority to target and harass innocent people because of their race." Mason's shoulders shook as the judge spoke, the full weight of his actions finally settling on him. For the first time since his arrest, tears began to flow down his cheeks as he confronted the reality of what he had done. Judge Stone consulted his notes before continuing. "The court has received numerous victim impact statements from people who were harmed by your conduct over the years. David Thompson, Maria Gonzalez, and others have described the lasting trauma of being targeted by someone they trusted to protect them." The judge paused, looking directly at Mason. Perhaps most significantly, Senator Isaiah Davis has submitted a statement describing not just the immediate impact of his arrest, but the broader message that your conduct sends to the African American community about their place in our society. Isaiah sat in the front row of the gallery, his expression composed but watchful. He had chosen not to deliver his victim impact statement in person, instead submitting a written statement that focused on the need for systemic reform rather than personal vengeance. "Mr. Mason," Judge Stone said, "I sentence you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from employment in law enforcement, and you will be required to perform 500 hours of community service upon your release." Mason's knees buckled slightly at the announcement of his sentence, but he remained standing as the judge delivered additional conditions of his punishment. "Furthermore," Judge Stone continued, "you will be required to attend counseling for racial bias and anger management, and you will make a public apology to Senator Davis and the other victims of your misconduct." The sentence was harsher than many had expected, reflecting both the seriousness of Mason's crimes and the judge's determination to send a strong message about police accountability. As Mason was led away in handcuffs, his former life officially over, Isaiah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Outside the courthouse, Isaiah addressed the media for what he knew would be the last time in his role as a victim seeking justice. Now it was time to transition to his role as a leader, working to prevent future victims. "Today's sentence sends a clear message that abuse of power will not be tolerated," Isaiah said, his voice steady and authoritative. "But our work is far from finished. We must now focus on the systemic changes necessary to prevent future Kevin Masons from terrorizing our communities." Denise Franklin stood beside him, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of a job well done. This conviction represents a significant victory for civil rights and police accountability. But as Senator Davis noted, it's just the beginning of the work that needs to be done. The civil lawsuit against the Charleston Police Department had been settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with the city agreeing to implement comprehensive reforms, including independent oversight of complaints, mandatory bias training for all officers, and the creation of a civilian review board with real authority to investigate misconduct. Chief Manning, who had managed to keep his job despite the scandal, announced the implementation of these reforms at a press conference held at police headquarters. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by the humility of someone who had learned painful lessons about leadership and accountability. The Mason case exposed serious flaws in our department's culture and practices, Manning admitted to the assembled media. We failed Senator Davis, we failed the community, and we failed to live up to the oath we swore to serve and protect all citizens equally. The reforms implemented in Charleston became a model for other departments across the state and nation. Isaiah used his position in the legislature to push through comprehensive police accountability measures that required similar changes statewide. 6 months after Mason's sentencing, Isaiah stood once again at the pulpit of Mount Calvary Baptist Church, but this time he was there for his usual role as choir director. The Thursday evening practice had resumed its normal routine, though the community center where it was held had been renamed the Isaiah Davis Center for Justice and Community Healing in honor of his courage in fighting for accountability. The choir members, ranging in age from teenagers to senior citizens, filled the practice room with the sound of traditional hymns and contemporary gospel music. Isaiah conducted them with the same passion and precision he had brought to his military service and political career. But there was something different about him now, a deeper sense of purpose and connection to his community. Jerome Washington, who had never missed a practice in the 15 years since joining the choir, approached Isaiah as the evening wound down. "Brother Isaiah, I keep thinking about that afternoon when Mason arrested you. At the time, I was angry and scared, but looking back, I think God put you in that situation for a reason." Isaiah smiled, adjusting the sheet music on his stand. "Maybe so, Jerome. But I think the real miracle is how the community came together afterward. That's when I saw the true power of our faith and our commitment to justice." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Morrison, who had become a regular attendee at community events since her testimony in Mason's trial. Her decision to speak out against her colleague had cost her some friendships within the department, but it had earned her the respect of the community she served. "Senator Davis," Morrison said, approaching with obvious respect, "I wanted to let you know that we've completed the review of all cases involving officers identified in the federal investigation. 8 officers have been disciplined or terminated, and we've reopened 43 cases for review." Isaiah nodded approvingly. "That's progress, Detective. Real progress." Morrison's expression grew serious. "I also wanted to thank you for not including me in your criticism of the department's failures. I know I should have spoken up about Mason years ago." Isaiah placed a hand on her shoulder. "Detective Morrison, acknowledging our mistakes is how we grow. Your testimony helped convict Mason and expose the system that protected him. That took courage." As the community center emptied and Isaiah prepared to lock up, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Mason's arrest had been the most traumatic experience of his life, but it had also become the catalyst for changes that would protect countless other citizens from similar treatment. Mason himself was serving his sentence at a federal minimum security facility in Georgia, where he spent his days working in the prison library and attending the counseling sessions mandated by his sentence. His fall from respected officer to convicted criminal had been swift and complete, a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked prejudice and abuse of power. In his cell late at night, Mason sometimes reflected on the chain of events that had led him to this place. If he had simply treated Isaiah Davis with basic human dignity, if he had recognized his own biases and worked to overcome them, if he had listened to the complaints that had been filed against him over the years, any of these things might have changed his fate. But Mason had chosen a different path, one that led inevitably to his destruction. His legacy would not be one of service, but of racial discrimination that he displayed.